This is the
Okay.
soft launch, as they say.
Everyone who's
Clark may
seeing
or may not
me,
return.
I'm split into two dimensions. We're waiting for Clark to return. In which
Soft
case,
launch. This is the soft
yeah.
launch of the stream.
In which
This is the
case,
soft launch, as they say.
yeah,
Everyone
Clark
see
may
I
or may
me.
not return.
I'm split
This
into
is
two
the early
dimensions. Oh wait.
access stream.
Oh, I had the stream playing in the background. Oh wait.
Oh man. Ah.
Give me 1 second.
I'm just gonna
Okay.
keep talking so it keeps doubling. That you keep hearing the audio twice before you fix it.
It should be good. Yeah, you shouldn't
Ah,
hear it.
damn it! I
Yeah,
missed my opportunity to be really obnoxious.
yeah, it should be good. Okay. We're gonna go ahead and propagate the links right now. So let me go ahead and get that out. You guys can share, by the way, you can share either link. You can share the YouTube link or the Twitch link. I
Okie
typically
dokie.
just I typically share the Twitch link because yeah, I do feel like Twitch is honestly a kind of a, not to knock on YouTube, but Twitch is still kind of the better viewing experience, I feel like, for most people.
For streaming, yes, unfortunately.
Yeah, and so, but I don't want to alienate the YouTube audience because
Indeed.
they're good, they're good kids too. Um, okay, so let's
Because
go ahead and get this. Okay, you may see nothing but gray right now. You may hear us, but that's because Discord does like this insane optimization thing where you minimize the window. You see me, you see me, and then you don't because Discord does like a weird optimization thing where it stops. So if I go blank, if we all go blank, we're still here. It's not a technical
We
error.
have all gone blank.
Yeah. It'll come back as I tab around to let everyone know that we're starting. I
we are fighting.
apologize.
We are actively
Yeah.
fighting against the whispers right now. I'm not helping very much because I don't mind the whispers so much. But Ryan is trying desperately to fight them off right now.
I am. I'm trying to defy fate. The most quintessential Final Fantasy thing you can do, apparently. Um, okay. And then my lovely thumbnail where it kind of looks like Clive is gonna give Cloud a little kiss.
Just a small smooch, not a
Just
big
a,
smooch, just a small
yeah,
one.
just a little smooch. Um, Go ahead and put that on there. Yes, I know I'm split into two dimensions right now for you guys. I'll promise I'll be in one dimension when Clark returns. Oh my gosh, there he is right now. Clark, how is the webcam coming along? Okay, we don't hear any audio from Clark, but he'll be here in a minute.
Hello.
Yes, sir. We're live. We
I
just,
know.
you
Hi
know.
guys.
Hi,
Hi,
Clark.
hi, YouTube and Twitch. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm just propagating the links. No, you're good. I'm propagating the links right now. Chat is chilling. Everyone's good. We're sorry that we're running a little late. You guys know that these things always kind of by virtue of having like more than one person especially our things are always gonna like, because whatever problems one person has, you then have to multiply it by however many streamers that you're collaborating with, and yeah, it's just always gonna be like this pretty much.
It's all
Oh,
part of the fun.
it is. Oh, what do I do with chat? Because I normally like to have chat on stream. Um,
Put it over my face. Well, no, what are we talking about? We literally have somebody whose face isn't here. Easy peasy.
oh yeah, well, how should I make this work? I'll move it around well enough so that,
We've got someone with
yeah.
a dead camera. We'll just slap it right over his face, and there's no trouble.
Yeah, maybe there will be some overlap there, but I think that would be
I,
fine.
I feel like I'm the most spiritually connected with what the people really want, anyways. So if you put it over my face, it's like I am the voice of the people.
That's what I'm talking
Okay.
about. That's the vision. That's what we should go for
All
here.
right. I'll let it overlap with Clark's box just a little bit since um Clark is spiritually with us. Okay. There we go. And then if I could just if I could finally actually get the link out. I'm sorry, guys. My apologies. We're gonna have such a good discussion today. It's going to be something that I feel is going to be really constructive about, kind of the Final Fantasy discourse. Because I do feel like, recently a lot of the discourse has been, how should I say, beside the point, actually. I think a lot of people are just kind of emotional. I think it's fair to be emotional because everyone is just really concerned about one of their favorite things ever that has provided, such an important, experiences to their life, I guess you could say. Everyone's really concerned about FF. Everyone loves FF, right? So let's unite over our love of the series.
Let's unite over our concern.
Yeah, and our concern.
I don't know about you guys. I'm concerned about Square's bottom line first and foremost.
Yeah, I'm also.
I mean,
concerned.
we do seem to be being told by everyone. I mean, like everyone kind of calms down, and then something new comes out, like a report or something, and then everyone starts being concerned again.
Yeah,
sometimes it's just the verbiage of a report that happened like in May.
Yeah.
Yes.
Too, and that's enough. Yeah.
And so honestly, I mean, it's difficult because everyone is concerned, everyone has a lot of ideas. But what I want to remind people here is that we are all playing for the same team. We're not trying to necessarily pit two things against each other or anything like that. I think what we're trying to do is have a constructive conversation about how we make this thing we love continue to thrive and do well. And so, same team. Please remember that we're all in this together today. And I also hope that this is something that can maybe unify the community in a way, bring us all together around the various different options today. Because at least for me, I don't know as much about you guys, but my perspective is that there are a couple of different avenues that they could really take that I think could probably get them back on track in a reasonably good way. So
I look forward to hearing what those avenues are.
really, it's just two. I did say it like
So
it was
there
a
are
lot.
two, and I know them. And if
Really?
anybody else
Yeah.
says otherwise, they're wrong. That's what Ryan just said. That's how we're kicking this off.
I want to thank Volsier for the $5 tip. By the way, I don't have the alerts on. I just saw that. I think it's pronounced Volsier. Thank you so much for the $5 tip. I do have the alert box hidden right now for the donation.
Are we still? By the way, are we still in the soft launch period of this stream, or are we really streaming now? Have we said?
No,
Are we
no.
waiting? We haven't said hard. Like the YouTube VOD hasn't started yet.
I was waiting on Clark to get the go ahead. Yeah.
Okie dokie. All
Oh,
right.
I'd say go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah.
This is the best we're getting.
Yeah. Okay.
All right.
So chat. Clark here will be here spiritually with us. Unfortunately, moments before his camera actually died and is no longer
I think he needs to tell the story because saying his camera died undersells it. You're like, oh, so batteries ran out?
Yeah, that's what I thought at first too. I was just like, okay, well then just make it alive again, dog. What's the
I think yeah. No, it's permadead. And that's the end of the story. I want this to be more interesting. I really do. But it's just that when you plug the camera in, it no longer comes alive. And that's what happens, It served, it was a good soldier for a solid 5 months. And then it just, stopped working. So, write a letter, strongly worded, to the developer.
To your camera, to your streaming congressman.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
All right. So are we saying go?
Yeah, I think one of you kind of has a bit of noise in the background. Clark, is it you?
Might be me. I'm not wearing headphones. It's probably me.
Okay, whoever just did that, it fixed it. Like whatever just happened.
I just turned you guys down a little
Wait,
bit.
no,
It was
I
probably
think I
me.
think I think it was Clark. Oh wait, Clark is on mobile. Is that why?
Yeah, I had
Yeah.
to go to mobile. It's a long story. Everything's so topsy turvy. We're gonna.
Did your
It's gonna be all
computer
right though.
also suffer a
Yeah.
fatality?
Yes,
Oh,
Kapoor
okay.
Yeah, I had to
says
take it
Clark's
apart.
camera lasted
Yeah,
longer than Concord.
yeah. Oof, oof. Harsh.
Oh my gosh. Okay. Let me just. I forgot one more link, and then to put out for actually on my YouTube community page, just for them. So if you don't have the notification out, you can always see it on the community page, and then we should be good to go. By the way, chat, audio sounding good, right? We're sounding really crisp and whatnot. We're sounding good. Just making sure because
Let's all take turns. Now I'll talk for a second. How do I sound? Do I sound okay? Daryl, you go.
I think you sound okay, but how do I sound?
chat, do I sound good or not? Don't lie to me.
Also, I believe
We have to put our
Ryan
faith
Dean
in chat.
Park subscribed at tier 1.
Do what?
I sound worse than people, and that's just gonna be the way that it is.
Okay. Not an
Because he's on
issue.
mobile. This is the way it is. This is the way it's going to be.
Put your AirPods in if you have some. The mics on those things are actually pretty decent, bro.
Somebody says I sound a little louder. I can make an adjustment. Hopefully that'll be a little bit better.
Oh wow, we got some subs here. Gene, thank you for the tier 1. Bottle Rocket, thank you for the tier 1 for 2 months. I'm watching the stream on the highway. Be careful. Nico, also thank you for the for the 2 tier 1 gift subs. I appreciate everyone for subbing. And I think that we are going to go ahead and get started. Let me pull up my agenda for today. And let's go ahead and, as the Loperates would say, hop to it. If my microphone would stop. I need a new arm. I upgraded to the Shure mic, and I was literally, because I had to buy the mic, and then I bought the audio interface, and it's like $600, and then I was too cheap to just buy a new arm. So I just been like ghetto rigging my current arm to work. Okay. Okay. Let's go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. I'm the Night Sky Prince, and today I am joined by a ton of very special guests, and we're going to be talking about the state of Final Fantasy. Now, recently, we have gotten some news that has reaffirmed that Final Fantasy XVI and Final Fantasy VII Rebirth may not have really met their profit expectations. This has left a lot of people concerned about where the future of the series is going to be headed. Naturally, we're all concerned. We all really love Final Fantasy, and we want it to do well. So today, I wanted to get together some community members that I think have really good minds on this stuff to discuss where we should go with Final Fantasy XVII. How do you get the Final Fantasy series back on course, growing again, selling more units with each game, and having a really healthy financial and critical outlook for its future? So I'm joined by Daryl from Final Fantasy Union. I'm joined by Frustrated Jacob, and I'm joined by Clark, aka Schrodinger's BabySeal. So if we can just go around and do introductions real quick. Daryl, we can start with you.
Okay, cool. My name's Daryl. I am from Final Fantasy Union, as Ryan very eloquently already said, and I'm really excited for this discussion actually because there's tons of very interesting things to debate and to discuss as we go through this interesting minefield.
All right, and Jacob.
I'm Frustrated Jacob. I don't know. I'm a YouTuber in the clinical sense. I don't make videos all that often, but I used to talk about Final Fantasy a whole heck of a lot, and technically I still do sometimes. Like I'm doing a playthrough of Remake right now with a couple of my friends. But yeah, I think. I mean, a long time ago, I was the Final Fantasy XV guy doing coverage of that game before it came out. Now I think I'm more of a, whenever I do make videos, I'm more of a broad games industry in general type person, which is great for YouTube metrics. But, you know, who cares about that? And I am also really excited to be here. I think this will be interesting. There's a lot of ins and outs, a lot of what have yous to be discussed today, and I'm looking forward to it.
Awesome. And Baby Seal.
Hi, I'm Schrodinger's BabySeal. My audio is a disaster, and I apologize in advance. A series of unfortunate events right before the stream started has me doing this on mobile, so I will try and keep things brief, concise, but do expect the best and most objectively true statements to come from me in this conversation.
Yeah. Chad, he
Would
just
expect
lied to
nothing
you.
less.
He just lied to all of you very beautifully, as he does. Because the most objectively correct takes will come from me. All right. No, if I'm being honest, they'll probably actually come from Daryl. I feel like you always like. I feel like a lot of the times, like what I'm thinking, you'll be able to express like the same thing but better. So I feel like
We'll see.
No, Jacob. Yeah,
a lot of pressure now.
yeah. No, no. Jokes aside. All of you gentlemen are extremely intelligent, extremely well spoken, and again, I'm just so grateful to have all of you here today. It means a lot to me. And yeah, you're also all like IRL friends now too. Well, except for Jacob. Jacob, I haven't met you IRL, but I've met Daryl IRL.
Eventually,
I've met Clark
someday.
IRL. Yeah, so this is awesome. We have like genuine familiarity with each other now. So I'm just gonna start with the elephant in the room. How impactful do you think PS5 exclusivity was to this situation? And would these games have met expectations if they were available on all platforms? Daryl, I think you have a lot to say on this one. So I'll let you take the floor first.
So I guess there's two aspects around this, and I know obviously initially you prefaced this by saying that the two games didn't necessarily meet expectations, and based on the wording, that's still kind of up for debate, but can also be implied. But I think the PlayStation 5 exclusivity has been made essentially a scapegoat for the wider performance. If the games 7 Rebirth, even Remake, and 16 had launched on PC and I guess Xbox platforms day one, would that have magically transitioned those games into being 10 15 million copy sellers? Probably not. But they could have been used to slightly increase the profitability of the games. And obviously, when we're talking about expectations, in the financial report, there were two aspects around it. The first one was, did the HD game segment as a whole reach profitability? And that's obviously the main objective of the company. And the answer to that is no. And obviously 7 Rebirth and 16 were a big part of that. They were probably the two biggest games. Well, they were the two biggest games that were released within that financial year. But we also had other games like Foam Stars, which probably didn't do that great either. Like, it's not like those two games are alone in their inability to be profitable. The other side of things is the sales. Now, Square Enix had previously said that 16 did meet sales expectations. So, there is that side of things. They did also then say that the tail of the game hadn't been quite where they'd hoped it would be, but it's far from a disaster. Rebirth, on the other hand, they did say in the financial report, had not really sold as well as they had hoped it was going to sell. Now, going on PC for both of those at launch probably would have changed that conversation slightly. It may not have drastically changed it, but it would have made the conversation a bit more positive. But I think, in terms of the exclusivity as a whole, if you think back to previous generations, the lion's share of sales has always come from PlayStation consoles. We're talking about, 70-80% of sales typically comes from PlayStation platforms, with the other platforms making up a smaller percentage. I think with 13, which is the one that's had the best ratio, it was around like 75-25% split in favor of PlayStation, and that was with like a huge amount of effort around pushing it on Xbox. They had the huge surprise reveal with Yuichi Wada walking up on stage, like the mass drama around it. Microsoft essentially kind of sweet talking Square because they knew how valuable that IP was to have on their system. But even with all of that and all of the marketing being focused around the Xbox version, they still only managed to sell around 25%, which, I think it was about 1 million-ish sales lifetime in comparison to a considerably larger number on PlayStation. And so, yeah, like it would have helped to get some more sales for sure, but it wouldn't have been like a massive game changer, I don't think, in either side of either the sales or the profitability.
Yeah, and we kind of saw a similar thing even too with 15. I think 15 on Steam did really well, but the Xbox sales probably weren't that strong, just given how Final Fantasy 13 on Xbox performed. And then you also have the very troubling state of Xbox in general right now, which is not that great. So it's hard to say that just, putting these games on Xbox necessarily would be like the magic cure-all. I'm sure it would help, but
yeah, I mean,
yeah,
I think the thing about Xbox that's slightly different is that obviously we have no idea how much PlayStation or Sony paid for the exclusivity deal. It seemed like it was partially around support and marketing budget, those kind of things, as opposed to like a straight like kind of cash buyout for exclusivity. But we don't really have any idea. Game Pass obviously changes the conversation slightly because based on the lawsuit, some of the figures that came out around Game Pass were pretty significant. I think Jedi Survivor was that Microsoft paid $300 million to have it on Game Pass. Suicide Squad was $250 million. You'd like to think that a game like Final Fantasy XVI or 7 Rebirth would command similar fees. And obviously I think it works out at assumed 3 to 4 million copies sold. If you're then putting that into the equation of 16, then that takes it from a 3 million selling game to the equivalent of a 6 million selling game. And that could be a pretty significant game changer. And obviously, Game Pass doesn't really work on sales anymore. It works on players. And so they probably would have said something like, I don't know, after a month, we've had 6-7 million players and everyone's saying, okay, this is great. This is really a good metric. So, but again, like in terms of the wider finances, would it have been better for them to cut a deal with Microsoft? Obviously, when they were making those decisions, it was off the back of Final Fantasy XV's less than stellar performance on the platform. So maybe they were thinking that, okay, well, we could do it, but our audience just isn't there. So it doesn't really make too much sense. Games like Jedi Survivor and Suicide Squad, they're much more likely to be played by Xbox players. So it's an interesting trade-off. And obviously Baldur's Gate 3, I think the pitch was like 5 million they offered for that. So
could you imagine? Could you imagine?
And I do think it's worth noting, it isn't just about this franchise. There are lots of games that are skipping Xbox entirely right now. And there's some questions about, like, is it compliance issues? Like, Pal World was pushed as a, Game Pass game. And it was like, I don't know if it's caught up now, but I know that for a while it was consistently like several months back in terms of patches because Xbox's compliance process was taking them longer to catch up. There's been a number of games recently that have been delayed, some of them delayed indefinitely for unstated reasons that seem like tech issues, getting them to work on Series SX for whatever reason. And there's a lot of indie people that are just choosing to skip Xbox entirely because there's not enough people potentially buying their games there for it to be worth going through the additional compliance process with Xbox.
I mean, that was what Black Myth Wukong had, right? They just essentially, there's no exclusivity deal. They just chose not to do it.
I think what happened, because there was this is a whole other news story now. I'm not going to do the detective work on this right now because it's not important to this conversation, but someone tried to leak a story to IGN that seems fake about how there was a secret backroom exclusivity deal that was unspoken for some reason. It seems like what actually happened is Wukong has some kind of memory leak issue that is Xbox specific, and they haven't fixed it yet, so they delayed its release. Or maybe canceled it. But that's the point. Is that's still kind of
I mean,
using nebulous.
It goes along with what you were saying, right? It's like there are technical issues. People are struggling to work with the system. It's a bit more complicated,
and it's not worth the hassle for the most part. Which is a funny thing to reverse from where we were with the cell processor and the PS3, decade and a half ago. But I guess one thing I want to add to this conversation that I think is important, because it's something that a lot of people don't understand, is when they hear Square, like a game didn't meet the expectations. I think they think, oh, Square wanted more money. They wanted to make more $1 billion, which is not, strictly speaking, the case. When they say that a game didn't meet expectations, they mean that it fell outside of what they wanted for their profit margin on the game. It's not just that they wanted to release a game that costs $10 and make $50 million. It's that the game costs this much, and it needs to make this much to be a success. And a good barometer of what that amount is actually has to do with investment. So obviously stuff like the Sony exclusivity deal, that is a huge investment into the development of the game. But there are other forms of investment as well. And basically, it's not just about, oh, shareholders got to make more money all the time. It's about, I'm going to give some money to Square Enix, however much. Did I make more money off of putting that money into Square Enix for the 5-year development process of, say, a Final Fantasy XVI than I did by putting it in the S&P 500 or the NASDAQ or whatever else? Otherwise, why am I taking a bet on this company as opposed to putting it into a mutual market? I know that's maybe a little bit more detailed than some people want to hear on this sort of thing, but it is important to understand that when they say, oh, Tomb Raider performed way below our expectations, it's not necessarily that they just got it in their brain that it needed to sell Call of Duty units. Now, you can blame them for deciding to put a Call of Duty budget into a Tomb Raider game. That is a choice that they made, when maybe they should have said, okay, we're coming back with a franchise that's been gone for a while. It's not as popular as it was back in the day. Maybe we should pump the brakes. Instead, they said, ooh, Uncharted, let's skip right past that. The Tomb Raider one's also a weird situation where people were like, how can it have not met their expectations? It sold all these units. And this is more like hearsay than solid numbers, but people will probably remember that they kind of panicked that game wasn't doing well enough, and it went on sale really fast. I think it was like barely 3 months before the Tomb Raider reboot was $30 instead of $60.
Yeah.
So yeah, their sales numbers went up, but they did not get instant. But they didn't get the cash in from those sales that they ought to have, or that they were expecting to.
I think it's also come out post sale that one of the reasons that Square Enix sold off Crystal Dynamics was that they struggled to be profitable as a studio as a whole. And Square Enix obviously bought Eidos with a view to increasing their global footprint. But what they didn't quite realize was that Crystal Dynamics as an entity were not very good at essentially making profit. They were very good at spending as much as they made, which, for this type of business, as Jacob is mentioning, it's not really the end goal. You want to be trying to, especially if you're listed on stock exchanges, etc., you have certain requirements that you have to meet. You don't have to make profit, of course, but it's one of the goals essentially. And I think weirdly enough, the budgets around gaming is such a mysterious thing, and I don't know how in movies it's this super transparent thing. Obviously, less transparent now with streaming services. They don't declare so much about how much they spend on production. But in movies, it's a much more open conversation. People know what the budget is. Sometimes it may or may not include marketing, but for the most part, it does. And then there's a general consensus about how much a movie needs to make in order to have turned a profit. Generally, if you're looking at Wikipedia and you're seeing, okay, it cost 200 million, it made 200 million, that's never a good situation for anyone. But with gaming, it's this more kind of like it's a very mysterious thing. No one really knows budgets. No one really knows how much games have actually made. So all we can do is look at these investment reports and just look at the way they describe it, and then try to draw our own conclusions.
Yeah. But I wanted to set that baseline as we're having this conversation, because I don't think this is a conversation necessarily about why is there a emoji next to my head in Discord? I've never seen that before.
I never have either. What was that? Anyway,
do this again.
It was obviously agreeing with what you were saying. It was like, there you go, look at that thumbs up.
Oh, that's interesting.
Anything? Yeah, there we go.
I had no
idea.
Hell yeah.
What?
Okay. Anyway.
Okay. Yeah.
I was just gonna say, I want to set that baseline, because this isn't necessarily a conversation about greed and thinking we just needed to make this much money. I think this is what I'm gonna talk about probably for a decent amount of this today, is about the budgets are wrong in the first place. I think that too much money is being spent on these games, and that's what's getting us here, not necessarily this idea of we have to be. That's my point. I wanted to establish a baseline of what we're talking about as we continue with this conversation, because there's a lot of nuance going on here.
I think it's a super valuable point, though, because again, as I said, like, there's a lot of miscommunication around budgets. You know, the estimated budget for 7 Rebirth, 7 Remake. We don't know 7 Rebirth, but the estimated budget for 7 Remake is around $150 million. You know, that is a pretty significant budget, and that doesn't include marketing costs as well, which would be within the $50 to $100 million range for a game like that, especially based on the things that they did. You know, that huge 14-minute Japanese commercial they pulled out, like all of the advertising you see out and in homes, and obviously all the different trailers they produce, etc. You know, these things cost a lot of money, and to get a return on a game that costs $250 million is quite difficult. And you know, obviously we've got some idea about that in the broader sense from the stuff that was unfortunately leaked via Insomniac. And you know, they talk about how essentially if you're working on a $300 million budget, you've got to sell 5.5 million copies to break even. You know, that's just to recoup what you've spent essentially. And we know for Remake that obviously they accomplished 5 million sales within like 3 or 4 months. They didn't break even day one. And that's not really a good scenario for a video game publisher. That's never where they want to be. And we don't really know, again, we don't really know about the profitability of the games, but we can assume, based on the fact that Kiryu had said in his statement that the previous regime that were overseeing Square, the HD Engage segment had never been profitable. And that's despite all the games they had produced. They are making as much money as they spend. And the only reason that Square Enix are doing particularly well is because the MMOs 14 has gone through like the world's best recovery. And Dragon Quest X is obviously still doing really well for them in Japan. And the mobile games, which are kind of sinking and not doing as well as they used to, were a massive cash cow between like 2018 and 2022. They were just absolutely just pumping money into the company. And it basically like papered over the cracks of the console game division just not really doing particularly well in terms of managing itself, managing spend, managing budgets, and trying to recoup those budgets.
I think that probably dovetails us into our next question pretty smoothly, actually.
Yeah.
The next item on our docket.
For sure. And by the way, you guys, oh yes, Clark, oh, you're back.
I would like to actually chime in on question one.
Sorry, I apologize.
Yeah.
No, yes,
no
please. Yes.
So what I'll say on exclusivity is that the short answer is no. It's impossible to really put a solid value to exclusivity, but something to consider is that there were 2 dedicated state of plays, one for 16 and one for Rebirth. That I mean, it's pretty impossible to put like a numerical value on that kind of branding, and you just don't see that from anybody else. Now, you could argue that Square Enix could do their own, and there's an argument to be made for that. In fact, I think the Square Enix Presents, where they first announced Rebirth, is the single most viewed video on the subject of Rebirth. I mean, to this day, other than maybe some, maybe the Max chats, but that kind of value is really hard to replicate in a sense. And if this were a day one PC release, day one Xbox release, multi-system release, I doubt we would be getting dedicated state of plays. And so those are things to consider when you're talking about exclusivity. That being said, you could argue that like just the promise of it being exclusive could sour the idea of it in some people's minds. It could, and those sort of things are so impossible to really track that, it's almost kind of like not worth discussing. And it does seem to be like kind of a distraction of the issue. So that's my quick, simple answer to that. Just to kind of agree with basically everything you guys have said.
I think the other interesting aspect around that is that it does seem as though exclusivity is not a barrier to sales. Essentially, I think it's worth putting that out there. If you look at Sony's first party games, we're at the point now where the Spider-Man 1, Miles Morales, and 2 have sold, I think, like 60 million copies by being exclusive. God of War 1 and 2 collectively are like 40 million. Yeah. And Horizon is like around 40 million as well across the two games. Like, if the game is there and people feel that it's good enough, then they will purchase. Obviously, I guess the difference here is that Final Fantasy as a franchise is typically catered to a slightly older demographic. Maybe they aren't ready to buy a PlayStation 5 yet, and maybe they haven't been very good at appealing to the people that actually own the system. And so in that sense, the exclusivity deal is probably counterproductive, because it only makes sense if you've got a deal that's exclusive to a system where people proactively want to purchase the game. Otherwise, it's not really that helpful.
Okay, so I was gonna get into something you just said, but I'm gonna save it for later. What I will say, I appreciated the comment about how valuable dedicated state of play is in terms of marketing. That's one of the highest viewed things. Because someone in chat a minute ago was talking about, did we ever find out how much uncovered Final Fantasy XV cost?
A lot.
And I think it's worth noting again.
A lot, yeah.
It's worth noting that the amount of cash in from an exclusivity deal like this is not insubstantial. We don't know the exact numbers, obviously, but you do have to always ask, is it offsetting what it would have sold on PC? Probably not, but it is doing something. It does have a significant impact on what they need to earn in the short term, that I don't think we can be ignored. That the fact that one of their biggest marketing boosts is something that Sony just did for them, and they didn't have to worry about it.
Yeah,
but also the other aspect is that
that's worth noting.
Something like Uncovered obviously did get broader appeal, but because of how insane it was. But it's largely preaching to the choir, right? It's selling the existing audience, the already existing player base on this new game, whereas a state of play is not really designed to do that. It's designed to try and convince the people that own the system that this is a game you should be paying attention to. It's not really designed to convince the fan base who are already invested that this is why it's worthwhile, which is why those kind of things are so valuable. Because, I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of people ended up watching the Rebirth state of play or the 16 state of play, but a lot of those people may not have watched it if it was a Square Enix Presents, for example.
Yeah, exactly. And I would also say, though, that there is, as soon as a state of play becomes dedicated, it will, in general, get less views. Every dedicated state of play, even if it's a God of War dedicated state of play, because the surprise element of its brand affiliation does go down. But that is something that Sony just will do for you. I doubt that there was any money that changed hands for that to happen.
Yoshida
that was
spoke
all
about that,
part
right?
of Yoshi P specifically said, I don't know what that means in dollars and cents, but I know it's a lot, and so that's that's just the way the business goes. So again, I think we probably all could agree that the other things that are getting in the way of success are things that would need to be addressed before we even deal with exclusivity.
100%. Wow, you guys covered it all really well.
I'll be right back. I just realized I'm gonna grab a piece of paper and a pen. I'll be right back.
Oh boy, here we go. Here we go again. Yeah, I mean, in terms of like what I have to add, I think you guys covered it all really well. Do I think they should go multi-platform from here on out? Yeah, absolutely. Just for the pure accessibility of it, to have these games there on day one on PC, on other platforms, but in particular PC, because I think that's where they can grow the most. That's where Capcom has really seen a lot of growth. I think that like 50% of Capcom sales come from PC nowadays. So Capcom is doing pretty exceptionally well on PC. So I do think that they should be available there day one for sure. However, yeah, like you guys mentioned, I don't think it's going to be like there's a PC port and in an alternate timeline where FF16 came out on PC day one or Rebirth came out on PC day one. Those games would necessarily go from like 3 million to like 10 or something like that. This is something that Daryl also mentioned during his recent live stream, and I really agreed with. So I don't think it's going to necessarily on its own turn around the situation entirely. However, what I do think is that it's a good first step. It will increase sales in a way that matters, but it will not necessarily turn around the diminishing growth, which I think is kind of the main issue right here, is that, whenever I talk to, again, I always use my nephew for an example because he's kind of my pulse on what the kids are playing right now. And I talked to him about Final Fantasy, and he, the look he gave me is just like, that's a boomer game.
Yeah, I also had the same thing.
Yeah.
Some of the people, like co-workers, they were like, what's good on PlayStation 5 right now? And I was like, maybe you should check out Final Fantasy 16. And they were like, really? Isn't that like I don't really want to play that kind of game kind of thing. And I was like, well, actually, this one's probably the most disconnected from what you think it is.
Yeah.
But they just still weren't associate. They still didn't want to associate with that game because it has a lot of people that are potential consumers. Like maybe they played one before in the past and they remember that as being Final Fantasy, and the newer audiences just don't even really know what to think about it because I think the releases are so sporadic. It's hard to kind of get a gauge on what it is.
Yeah.
I was wearing. I want this to be an incorrect statement, but I was wearing a Rebirth jacket that I got from an event, and thank you Square Enix, and it had the Buster Sword on it, and a kid said, "Hey, that's from Blue Beetle, right?" And it broke my heart, like, because Blue Beetle is a DC movie that referenced the Buster Sword, and that was all that kid knew, And this was like a prime candidate person, like this was not like a teenager. This was a 20-something guy with tattoos and a bunch of weeb stuff adorning him, and he had no idea what I was wearing. And so it's just kind of I mean, like I have countless experiences like that where you have to be like, if you're in your 20s, you have to be like an elite weeb, like uber weeb, to know what Final Fantasy is, or you've got to be over 30. Those are like the two. Yeah.
Like during the golden era, like everyone knew Final Fantasy. It was like one of the premium properties. And I know obviously the hope at Square Enix is that they can return to that status. But it's a long path because ultimately there's just so much competition these days.
And I'm sure
one
we're
of the
getting to
dovetail
that
topics.
topic. Yeah,
That's
that's
the next item on the docket, basically.
Yes.
I was going to say one of the dovetail topics, Ryan, with the exclusivity as well, is around install bases, right? It's the accessible market, and so much is made around this. But I think I also mentioned this on the stream that they can be a slightly deceptive metric because when the install bases are smaller, typically there's less competition for purchasing. There are less games produced. There are less choices for people to have, the larger the install base, the larger the software library. So the chance of someone wanting to purchase your game instead of the however 100 many others diminishes significantly.
I have a
Obviously,
perfect
if you don't have
example
the
of this.
exclusivity, there's more option. There's more potential consumers then.
You know what? You know what like came to my mind when I heard you say that on your stream? I thought about Wave Race 64. Did you guys like pick up that game? Like when Nintendo 64 launched, if I recall it correctly, it was literally just Mario 64 and Wave Race 64, and those were the only two games. And Wave Race 64 was a pretty decent game. But none of you guys would have actually bought Wave Race 64 if Ocarina of Time was out.
Right. Right. If you have $50 and a gun to your head, you're walking away with Ocarina.
Yeah, exactly, right? And so, with 2 games out, and that's the only selection, people did buy Wave Race 64. And that's not to say Wave Race 64 wasn't a great game at the time. It actually was. Is it Wave Racer 64? My bad.
That's correct. There were other items, but not of great significance. So yeah.
Yeah.
That wasn't right at launch. Or I don't know. I'm probably looking at Japanese dates here. Doesn't matter. Point remains. Point stands.
Yeah, Kevin Voot, thank you so much for the super chat. He says, "Have you seen less games this generation? Has been excited for. This can't just be an FF thing."
No.
It is, but it isn't. But it is.
Yeah, I mean, there's if you go back and look at like the late 90s, how many big budget like AAA games, or what would be classified now as AAA games, there were very few per year. You could easily kind of budget it out, whereas now there are so many games being released. I mean, Steam has like over 1,000 a year or something crazy, and like, even on the platform consoles, there's generally like at least 2 or 3 new console games releasing every week. Yeah, and sometimes I think during the Rebirth window, there was like, I don't know, 6 high tier role playing games releasing within a month. Like you have to make some choices. Like
I have a hard time being unexcited right now. Sure, studios individually are making fewer games, but there are so many games being made, and the indie scene is so active. I think this is actually a pretty decent time to be into video games. It's just maybe not the best time to be into your favorite franchise. And I don't say that meaning FF. I mean anything that isn't like a dragon, basically.
Yeah. All right. This is actually a great time to segue into our next point here. The Final Fantasy brand has been on decline for quite a while now. Aside from 15, each entry has been selling less or the same for quite a bit of time. With 16 and Rebirth reaching kind of the lowest point yet, this is also combined with steadily increasing development costs. Steadily may not even be the word, actually, really here.
No.
These dev costs are not steadily increasing. They're increasing at an enormously fast rate. And even with games increasing to $70 now, it still isn't enough to cover these astronomical costs. So, why isn't Final Fantasy growing in terms of sales? Is there a problem with the brand? What do you identify as like the issue here?
Do you want me to hop in first?
Clark, you're welcome to hop in first. Go ahead. Yes.
Okay, so my just a little bit of a breakdown of the individual items here. I think Final Fantasy XVI, I think failed to meet some of the expectations set for branding because of its dev cycle. Like the development time was just too long. I think Yoshi P really successfully identified the problem with the Final Fantasy brand, which is that more people are buying Monster Hunter, but basically that we're not appealing to the youth. And it isn't just that youth buy games en masse. That's not even the point. The youth are an incredible metric for how popular a thing is. That's why it's important to gauge whether or not you are attractive to young folks. Game of Thrones was attractive to young people, despite it obviously not
Yeah.
targeting young folks.
You want relevancy.
It's about this constant awareness, finger on the pulse, that they have on the zeitgeist, right? So they're this incredible metric for the zeitgeist. I think very successfully, Yoshi P recognized that is a problem with the Final Fantasy brand. However, the solution that he presented was one that would have worked 3 years prior to its release instead of when it was released. Had it released before the 8th season of Game of Thrones, when Game of Thrones immediately fell out of favor, I think that would have been a better target market, right? So dev cycles make it really hard to predict what's going to be cool.
Wow. That is an excellent point.
Possible,
Yeah, I mean,
but the amount of like prescience that you need as a development staff, the amount of youth you need as a development staff, the solution to that problem rarely is going to come from a developer, a veteran developer over 50, unless you're Kojima, like, who is just cool forever. Like, it's really rare to find people that can kind of be that forward thinking for that long. So this is one of those things where a younger dev team really comes in handy, and a shorter development cycle really comes in handy. I think Rebirth had a lot more of the formula correct, and I think that it actually probably is a cooler title. The reason that I think Rebirth is more a victim of the economy. Like, you're seeing most games in 2024 not selling that much. Like, we're seeing these bizarre anathematic exceptions like Palworld and Wukong, but they have anathematic reasons for selling as well as they do. So Rebirth, I think, does get a lot of the stuff right. It has a shorter dev cycle. It has developer retention, so it can address things that that are more relevant and now. I think that there are things that it does to address that problem better. I do, however, think it was incredibly undermarketed, compared to Final Fantasy XVI. And I think that Final Fantasy XVI's marketing and then underperformance did sour some people on the brand right before investing in Rebirth. I think there is a little bit of that working against Rebirth. I think it can turn around if it wins Game of the Year, or something.
Even nominations speak volumes.
Yeah, they do. Not as much as a win though.
No, sir.
But that said, that said, I still do think that what we're looking at is an idea that was really focused on nostalgia, and although it can build a new thing, it can bring new people in. Like Trigun Stampede brought a lot of new people into Trigun with its really fresh coat of paint. It still does do some of those things wrong, where it just likes to really faithfully recreate what it is, but just like the best that it can do, in this way that's so ambitious and expensive that even if the Rebirth or the Re-Trilogy were to get comparable sales to, let's say, RE2 through RE4 remake, it might not be seen as much of a success, simply because of how lean Resident Evil was. Those
games aren't costing like $150 to $200 million to make.
And remake, not Rebirth. Remake's dev cycle was disastrously long. There's no real numbers to substantiate this, but there's no way you could tell me that even with Rebirth's massive amount of scale comparable to Remake, that it didn't cost more than Remake. Rebirth definitely did not cost more than Remake, just because usually the biggest expense is labor, and the dev cycle for Remake was like 2 companies and 6 years.
Yeah.
7 really. And so whereas we have a 4 to 3 year dev cycle depending on who you ask for Rebirth. So just in labor alone, there's we're looking at a better retention there. So these games cost a ton to make, and and the brand recognition of them puts a amount of development pressure on them to be something that is generally unfair. And when it doesn't meet that, it does damage to the brand. I still say this. I think if Final Fantasy XVI didn't even have Final Fantasy on the title, but were made by a company other than Square Enix, people would be like, this is a really, really interesting addition to the Devil May Cry genre, and I hope we see more games like it. But because it's Final Fantasy, people aren't really asking that. Like, there are people that liked it and are asking that of it, but nowhere near as much as the feeling it would have got if it were injecting something that felt genuinely like
people
a
would have
new
been
brand.
more people would have been more interested and intrigued to try it, I think.
Yeah. Or even if it didn't sell as much, I don't think that the taste people had in their mouth about it would have been as, well, this didn't meet my Final Fantasy expectations at all. I genuinely don't think that. Yeah.
It is a very weird situation in terms of sales because, if you look at the 2 games in isolation, when 7 Remake came out, it was the fastest selling PlayStation 4 exclusive or PlayStation exclusive ever. Obviously, it was then surpassed not too long after. And Final Fantasy XVI was the fastest selling PlayStation 5 exclusive because God of War Ragnarok and Horizon Forbidden West also came out on PlayStation 4. So it's not like these games are not doing well. And as Clark said, in terms of the economy, Rebirth in Japan is still the best selling release of this year, like by far. Like it's not the best selling game this year in Japan because it's been superseded by 2 Switch games that didn't release this year. But in terms of just isolating to 2024 releases, it's the best-selling game in Japan. And, you can't really do much better than being number 1. Yeah, sure, it could have done well, but ultimately the markets are diminishing in different ways. There's not much Square can do about that, but what they should also be doing is course correcting and not trying to repeat the same strategy that they previously had, which is what they seem to be doing here. I think, even as soon as they announced that the remake project was going to be a multi-part series, which is obviously the initial wordage that they used, I think we all secretly knew, but hoped it didn't, but we all secretly knew it was going to replicate the fate of the 13 trilogy. And because Square, especially like Kitase's division, they've never really shown that they can handle a property like that and do like an Assassin's Creed or a Mass Effect where they manage to either maintain sales or increase sales as it continues. And I think that was always the fear. And unfortunately, with Rebirth, it looks as though that fear has been realized, and then it does put questions in terms of what happens next, because it's pretty well known that Lightning Returns had its budgets massively slashed, and it is some people absolutely love Lightning Returns, but if you're looking at the performance of the game, apparently it was still roughly profitable because of how much they just slashed costs. But in terms of sales and reputation management, it didn't really do what Square wanted. And I don't think that with the part 3 in this trilogy, they can afford that to happen again, which means, from a profitability question, it's going to be a bit dicey from that perspective. So there's a lot of things to kind of weigh up, but ultimately, like in terms of the sales, it's just, what people want and what Final Fantasy is.
Right.
Because there are so many cases now where games are coming out that are selling like absolutely ludicrous amounts, and with the budgets that Square Square Enix aren't alone in this. There are so many companies that are making these mistakes, and it's exactly the same that's been happening in the movie industry as well. The budgets get high, which increases a huge element of risk in terms of you have to make sure that this returns. But because that risk is there, you have to then decrease risk as much as possible by making the game as safe as possible. But because the budgets and the cycles are so long, it's so hard to course correct. If maybe something has changed, as Clark said, if 16 had come out 3 years prior, the landscape on the consoles would have been different. There would have been less things to compare the game against. It may have matched with people's desires more, but when those things didn't necessarily happen, they maybe they were aware behind the scenes that 16 wasn't going in the right course. But I think Alana Pierce had spoken about this in terms of because she's working at Santa Monica. When you're working on these massive AAA games, you can't suddenly just make narrative decisions 5 years into the project that change things, because you've got to redo so much of the game to accommodate for that you just kind of have to stay the course and hope it works out in the end.
Yeah.
Even animated features have very similar issues. You've probably heard a little bit about the apparently hellish behind-the-scenes situation on the last animated Spider-Man film, because the directors were demanding finished shots be completely redone. It's not like in live action where you point a camera at an actor and you get the shot again. Creating one shot in an animated film is a months-long, step-by-step sequence of processes that goes through multiple different departments. You can't just look at a finished shot and go, we're going to redo that, and have your crew be happy with you, which is why stuff gets boarded so heavily. I can make that comparison to say it's not even just video games where it's hard to course correct. Live action filmmaking and TV, sometimes they can be nimble enough to make adjustments, but even in animation, in any form of animation, it's very difficult to make these adjustments, especially in games.
And I think how you generally address versatility and nimbleness and agility in the gaming space or in the dev space is with dev retention. Developers that are familiar with how they work, how their team synergizes, are going to see sort of ahead on these issues. They're going to make these decisions that say, hey, this is scalable, I'm going to make this decision. And one of the things that I think I noticed in Rebirth that worked really well, that I think is probably a holdover from Remake's development, is much less reliance on what the shells of visual works, right? Less pre-rendered cutscenes, and that helps with scalability. And in order to be able to be confident in making adjustments as the landscapes change, you need a team that's really comfortable with itself. And that's something to consider when you're trying to manage a brand, is how consolidated everybody that works on that brand is. And the recent, I think, readjustment, the change from creative business unit to creative studio, what it seems like that might point to is this idea of consolidating as much of the brand under maybe less studios, at least long term. Not right now because of things that they already had going, but I think that's a potential solution to the problem. Is you have dedicated teams with a ton of retention that can really adequately read the marketplace and read a changing landscape, a development landscape. Rebirth, I think, is a really good example of how to actually deal with that.
Yeah, very well said. One thing I definitely want to touch on that you guys were talking about was this idea that, games take so long to develop now that you can't even really adjust to the trends as time goes along. I almost wonder, and I'm not saying this would necessarily have happened, but I do kind of wonder if Final Fantasy XVI had started development a little bit later than when it did, if it wouldn't have pulled a little bit more from the Soulsborne genre, just because that became the more prevalent style of action RPG, that
Maybe.
games that are adjacent more so to Souls than, say, Devil May Cry. I kind of wonder if that game wouldn't have leaned in that direction, just because that became more of the trend for action RPGs to do, rather than for them to hybrid in hack and slash elements in the way that 16 did. And I'm not saying that it
Yeah,
should have been a Souls game or that it would have been better or anything like that. It's just a
one of the
theory, yeah.
One of the big things was Elden Ring came out, right? You
Yeah.
know, and I think Yoshida, when I spoke to him and on the press tour, he talked about the fact that, you know, once upon a time the game was in development for PlayStation 4. You know, but they kind of binned that off because it just didn't make sense for them anymore because of development struggles, delays. You know, we know that the pandemic had a huge impact on the development of that game. You know, they announced it with this big splash, and Yoshida made this whole thing about how they're going to release this game sooner than you think, and then they were forced to go quiet for like over a year and then apologize because they didn't meet the deadlines in terms of when they were going to share information. You know, that's the nature of the beast, isn't it? It's like, you know, Xbox 360 going to market before PlayStation 3. It gave them a huge advantage in terms of that console generation. The first of the punch generally is the one who can control the conversation, and Square Enix have unfortunately gained a significant reputation for announcing things way before they should do, and then just kind of having this thing happen in the background and letting things happen around them, which then changes expectations. And when things ultimately do happen, it becomes a bit harder to align with those expectations as a result.
Absolutely.
Okay. I want to talk about a couple of things, if that's all right, before we move on to the next item.
Yeah. Oh, please go ahead.
With regards to declining sales, which is what this conversation is about, getting people's attention. One of the items that we talked about earlier, Daryl, I'm gonna argue with you a little bit on one item, is that on the last last topic, I should say, you talked about that the older audiences, you know, weighing the decision of, do I want to buy a PS5 for these games? And obviously the audience for FF is older, generally speaking, because it's always targeted an older demographic. We actually have the console audience is the audience that's aging. Kids are playing on their phones, and they're playing on PCs and maybe the Nintendo Switch. They don't want PlayStations, they don't want Xboxes. It's not just that Final Fantasy is a boomer thing. Consoles are boomer things. And I'm not even bringing this up to talk about, you know, oh, well, it would have been done better if it was on PC. Final Fantasy is, I think, a unappealing brand to most people right now. And I don't mean that they've played it and they don't like it. People in our chat who are upset about the current state of the series, I'm not talking about you. I am saying that the brand being carted out in front of people does not carry any prestige right now. And this whole, we're going to get into, you know, we'll debate back and forth on how we got there. But the reason I bring this up is because there's been debate about, you know, oh, what can be done to bring it back? What can be done? Oh, just make it turn-based again, and then people will come back to it. No, that's not going to fix any of this series' problems necessarily. It might make the base happier, but there needs to be a much broader rethinking of what's going on to actually broaden the audience, which is what they need to do if they want to keep operating the budgets they're operating at, or they need to scale their budgets back to be within the audience that they have. But I also like that you brought up COVID. Somebody in chat was mentioning this as well, that the numbers on Remake, the first one, may very well be a little bit inflated because that was the first COVID game. That came out like week 1 of lockdowns happening. There were concerns that when it first came out about we may not be able to ship it to people right away because the world was shutting down.
People double bought as well as a result.
At the exact time that game came out. And I think there's, you know, I can't speak to myself, obviously, because I was going to play the game anyway, but there may be a certain number of people who just got locked in their houses and went, what's out? I'm not saying that that's necessary. I don't want to make a judgment call on how significant of a sales bump that caused, but I do think it caused a bump. I think units were sold that would not have been sold on week 1 if COVID hadn't happened. And I
think it definitely affected profitability because there was a big shift in terms of digital purchases because of the shipping issues. And, you know, I don't know how many people did, but yeah, as I just mentioned, that people double bought the game because they were like, well, I don't know if I'm going to get my physical copy for another 2 weeks, and I want to play it now. And Square themselves noted that it was one of the most profitable games they'd released because of the digital ratio, but still didn't make the game profitable.
And I think that you talked about it being fastest selling PS4 game, then 16 very fast selling games, but then we're disappointed by the legs. That's because I want to get the name right. I apologize. There's a market analyst named Daniel Ahmad. He's on Twitter. Yep. He works for Nico Partners, and he said a week or so, quote, "The reason Final Fantasy games have seen declining sales is because only super fans who were 15 in 1997 and played plus 10 FF games in the past year are buying them. They're not appealing to general fans and new audiences. The reason these games are selling so well is because people like the 4 people in this chat room are buying them the second they come out. And the reason that it's falling off is because they are not attracting new users." Now, there's another thing to bring up here, which is I see people in chat getting upset. They've tried to bring in new people, and they failed, obviously. Not true. 16 sold, not 16, I apologize. 13 sold well. 14 is the best example we can possibly point to of the series bringing in new fans successfully. And Final Fantasy XV brought in a ridiculous quantity of new fans. Now, a lot of that was off the back of the marketing. A lot of that was off the back of the game being fairly accessible. I don't just mean that it was on a lot of platforms. I mean that it was just a game that kind of got going right away and it was simple. And they did a really good job of communicating. No, jump in here, it's fine. And there was the meme quality surrounding it. There was the Half-Life 3 confirmed sales bump, as I like to call it. Kingdom Hearts 3 got a bit of that too. The thing about that is, and we actually mentioned Resident Evil a little bit earlier, and I'm probably going to talk about Resident Evil a lot during this stream. But Resident Evil is a good example to point to of Resident Evil 6 is bad. People don't like it. It's a mess.
Yeah, that was the end of the we think Capcom's going under period because the quality of all their IPs.
But it was until recently the best-selling game in Capcom's history. Why? Yep. Because Resident Evil 5 was awesome. Was fantastic.
Yep.
Resident Evil 4, even better. So there's that built-in buy there. So when people look at, Final Fantasy 15 sold 10 million units, but then 16 only sold this many, what does that mean? Does that mean that people just recognize 16 was a lot worse? I think, no, a lot of people bought 15 and had mixed feelings on it. And then most importantly, like a decade passed, which is another important item to talk about here, which is that I think that the biggest problem that we're dealing with these games is not just that the dev cycles are long and they cost a lot of money. It's that they're being very precious with their IP. Something I kind of want to talk about, maybe we'll get to this later, is why was Bravely Default not called Final Fantasy?
Yeah.
Why was Bravely Default
there is a specific reason as to why, but
well, why don't you go ahead and share the reason, because I think we should talk about it.
So basically, and this was actually one of the things that was discussed on my previous stream, because I was talking about Asano's division and how essentially they operate as a company within a company. They have managed to create a very dedicated group of people that like buying their games. They would buy them whether they had the Square Enix branding or not, because they're by that specific team. They churn out consistent numbers. Almost all of their games sell within the 1 to 2 million copies range. In the past, though, they worked on the 3 remake, they worked on the 4 remake. They got asked to they basically said, do you want to work on the 5 remake or do you want to work on your own Final Fantasy game? They said, we're done with remaking games. We want to work on the 4 Heroes of Light. They then got asked the same question again. So Bravely Default was supposed to be a sequel to the 4 Heroes of Light, but Asano was like, no, I want to build my own IP. I think I can do a good job of doing this. So they specifically distanced themselves from Final Fantasy, which is obviously one of the curious things about it in terms of like, why would you do that? And actually Bravely Default sold way better than the 4 Heroes of the Light as a result of distancing itself from the brand. And there were, it's interesting you said about Square being very precious with the IP, and I think they went through a very difficult period during Yuichi Wada's watch, where he was like, Final Fantasy, we've got Dragon Quest, we've got Kingdom Hearts, we've got these IPs, we need to exploit them as much as possible. And it diminished the IP significantly. As a result of that, they put out ridiculous quantities of games that didn't have very good quality control around them. And then Matsuda, again, he's now the villain because he's the most recent CEO. But his initial, and even Wada, when Wada essentially saved the company, without Wada, we wouldn't even be here talking about this anymore. So, but everyone remembers what happens at the end, not the beginning. But Matsuda realized that the Final Fantasy IP had been degenerated, and he basically since 2020, the frequency of Final Fantasy releases has significantly cut down. There are almost no spin-offs being produced outside of those related to the compilation of Final Fantasy VII, and Stranger Paradise, of course. But like, if you think about the time before, there were countless spin-offs being produced all the time by random teams. Like, I think Hashimoto was the brand manager. I don't know what kind of control he had over what was actually happening or who was supervising anything.
I've always
during
been
the
really
Square
curious
era, it
about
was
that too.
very, very different. Sakaguchi had 100% control over how the brand was seen by the audience. If they were going to do a spin-off that they thought was a bit kooky or wacky, they would whack the Chocobo brand on it. Yeah. If not, it was a tactics. There were very few spin-offs that they felt would work, and if they did, they were very, very careful about the subgenre or side genre they went into to make sure it appealed to slightly, brought in new fans while also appealing to the existing audience.
Well, I mean, we can talk about the success of the 90s strategy until we're blue in the face, because it was obviously very successful. But the problem is, even by the 2000s, our dev cycles are increasing substantially. And I think it's relevant to note that if you got into Final Fantasy when a lot of people did, which was when FF7 came out, obviously people were into it before then on the NES and the SNES, but most people got into it in 1997 when that game sold however many million units that it sold, and it blew people's minds all over the wall. And they had the stupid ad where they said the biggest adventure of the year will never come to a theater near you. But in that time period, you could play 7, Tactics, all of the re-released old games on the PlayStation, the Chocobo games, a stupid kart racing game, 8 and 9. And I'm going to go ahead and include Vagrant Story, because I think we basically all consider Vagrant Story an honorary little Final Fantasy game, even though, it didn't sell super well because it was right when the PS2 was about to come out. The point is, it was really easy to stumble into this franchise and become engaged with it. And it was really easy to be picky and go, I don't like Final Fantasy VIII. I think it's stupid. I think Final Fantasy IX is ugly. These are bad takes. But you could do this and still gorge yourself on a Final Fantasy buffet. Right. In the 2000s, which is when I got into it, because I'm a little bit younger than that, I also had a plethora of options in front of me. I had the Kingdom Hearts series, which was the greatest advertisement for the Final Fantasy franchise they've made, other than, and now the greatest adventure of the year will never come to a theater near you. There were the Tactics Advance games, which were meeting people in a totally different demographic in a different location. There were the Crystal Chronicles games, which were deliberately designed to be more kid-friendly and had that more of a, chibi design. They were successfully going out and going after different brackets of the market. Now, we can say, Tactics Advance and A2 were not the masterpieces that Tactics were, but they sold well. They played well. That was something where they were still on that periphery of this still had a strong brand value, and I'm a kid and I have a Nintendo DS but not a PlayStation 2 or whatever else, and I can go, Final Fantasy 3, I'll play that. Tactics Advance 2, I'll play that, and you can get in. And you don't have that standard to tell you this is inferior. Now, certainly, we see a decline in quality and certain things did damage the brand, but I think it's less to do with the games being bad and more to do with a lot of it getting sillier. Like, I think Dirge did a lot bad. I think about that as like somehow adjacent to Shadow the Hedgehog in terms of normies being like, oh, come on, what are you doing? And totally losing people and people feeling like the franchise was losing the plot. But again, that comes out next to Final Fantasy XII, which maybe you hate, maybe you like. It comes out next to Final Fantasy IV on the DS. It comes out next to a Chrono Trigger re-release. My problem with what they're doing lately, I understand that they are being more precious with the IP because they were concerned that they have a quality image that's a problem, and they did for a little while. Especially 13 generated. 13 is the biggest problem they've had for this IP basically ever. And I think part of it is because people complained about the wrong things with that game and they overcorrected in the wrong directions. But I think the biggest problem is because they got so precious with this IP, but because they still think they need to be the top dogs, they are still the biggest franchise, they need these 6-year-long dev cycles and the game has to be perfect. Now, maybe you love Final Fantasy XV. Maybe it is your absolute favorite game of all time. And if it is, more power to you. I like it quite a bit as well. However, if you didn't like it, where's the other Final Fantasy games to try?
Yes.
There is no easy way to get on board with this anymore. The quantity of titles people in the old days would complain about, oh, well, where do I start? And that is a problem. But now, why would I start? I played Final Fantasy 15 and I didn't like it. And there's nothing else anywhere around it for me to try. There are no smaller, cheaper experiences. And even something like Kingdom Hearts, which again, I really feel like is a valuable outreach for this IP. Kingdom Hearts 3, it's all gone. We don't need that anymore. There's virtually no presence on the Nintendo Switch other than re-releasing the old games in, I'm going to say, broadly unexciting packages.
Yeah.
I don't want to be down on the pixel remasters, but like if you're a fan of Final Fantasy VII, you probably didn't bother buying, the Switch re-release of it because you've played it before. Whereas if you really loved 3 or 4, you might have bought that DS remake because it was novel. Sorry, that was a lot but I apologize. It's cede the floor.
There's a few interesting things in there. I'll let you go first, though, Clark.
There were interesting things in there, and I do think that precious is a good way to describe how they are being with the IP, and it is silly in some ways. There's mistakes they make with the value of the IP. Sometimes they're far too imprecious, and I think Stranger of Paradise is a fantastic example of that, as well as The First Soldier. There are times when it's like, that's maybe... we would love to see quality control. I mean, there were bats in Stranger of Paradise that had the polygon count of 50 cloud strifes from Remake. Like, it was just, sometimes there's some rough development stuff that happens at the company and the brand as a result. And, that's a project that Nomura had, a hand in.
I was going to say there may have been a common denominator there.
Yeah. There is sometimes where the brand really doesn't catch itself, and First Soldier and Stranger of Paradise, although I did get genuine enjoyment from both of those things, it does you do see those things and say, does Final Fantasy have prestige anymore if those two things exist? And it's hard to say yes, but then at the same time you're like looking at things that they have stayed out of because they're like Jacob's saying, too precious. Not being an Astrobot is the biggest fumble that I could possibly imagine. I would have given that away for free if I were Kotaku. I would have been throwing models at them.
I wasn't going to bring this up, but since you mentioned Astrobot, I have to talk about it. Why are Cloud and Sephiroth only speaking in Japanese in Smash? Speaking from experience, I'm playing Melee as in the early 2000s or Smash on the N64, right? Oh, who's Samus? Who's Fox? I don't know these characters. These are neat because maybe I missed them because I only know Mario or Pokemon or whatever else, right? But you're playing Melee. Who's Roy? Who's Marth? I can't understand what they're saying. I'm going to ignore them. I know that sounds really condescending, but when you're 12, it's true. And you've got this, again, Ultimate should have been the greatest Cloud Strife pitch of all time. But now he is in the weirdo bracket next to Terry. Oh, something for the boomers.
Oof, that Terry stray. Really uncalled for, Jacob.
No, listen, I love Terry. I was excited when he got in Smash, but that's my point. Is the 12-year-olds are like, who's this guy? Oh, it's someone for boomers.
So
you're not reaching out to them when you're like, oh, we're not gonna. I don't know. Sorry, go ahead.
I might have to push back on that one personally, and
Okay.
maybe this is because I am a boomer. But actually, when I did play Melee, and I saw Marth and Roy, and like, I don't know how old I was when GameCube came out, but I still thought that Marth and Roy were cool as hell,
Same.
and I did actually go and buy Fire Emblem for like the Game Boy Advance ports of Fire Emblem for that reason. That being said, though, I even despite me pushing back on that aspect, I still would agree that like for the sake of brand, it probably wouldn't have been a bad idea actually to have them like
No.
speaking English in there to kind
I
of
don't want to
bait.
sound like I'm speaking ill of Marth and Melee. I'm saying my own personal observation.
Oh yeah.
Unfortunately,
No.
I know
Sure.
how stupid kids. I
And-
know how stupid kids think.
Right.
And the other thing I want to push on is, again, we're trying to capture a new audience, and you had an exclusivity deal with Epic Games for Remake on PC for way too long, yet we couldn't throw Cloud Strife in Fortnite. Like, Fortnite is
We
a
need our own
much better.
Fortnite.
Honestly, like Cloud Strife and Fortnite would have done more for the brand than the entire release and gotcha everything that was made by First Soldier. And it's just those are the kind of ways that I think the brand is the wrong kind of precious. Personally.
Yeah.
And I do also want to say, because I've seen it in chat a couple times, and Jacob, you did respond to this, and then I'd love to give it back to Daryl because he has a lot to say on this. Is that yes, they have tried to capture new audiences before. The fact that they failed does not mean they should stop trying to capture new audiences. There's no real way, despite other than really like making just like really boring scaled back versions of products or relying on AI, where the company sustains itself on Final Fantasy fans. And I think if, like, in case, I don't know, more weird bad stuff happens and I get disconnected, the most important message I want to say, like, if you are Square Enix and you are listening to this, do not listen to Final Fantasy fans. We don't know what we're talking about. That, and I mean that from the bottom of my heart. Focus on new people. Make the brand something that my kids talk about. That's what I really think people ought to do. The fact that they haven't done it yet doesn't mean they shouldn't keep trying, because the alternative is so much more bleak for the brand, personally.
Yeah.
And I'll stick to this. Yoshi P was right about the problem. He was just too late on that particular type of solution. The DMC was just too late. And
I mean,
yeah.
Even before that, I think Tabata had realized the problem. I mean, the way he went about marketing the game, the problem was he didn't have enough time to make the game that needed to come out. Like, they had a deadline, and he did his damnedest to hit that deadline. And, then to his credit, he still continued trying to fix the game and make the game something. Just like, we're just going to patch it together and keep shoving stuff on it until we can try and make it a semblance of what we hoped it would be in the beginning. And there was a lot of goodwill gained by that too. But then obviously, to Jacob's point about the games taking so long, different teams, the goodwill that Tabata created was then lost to the ether. Who knows what would have happened had he stayed at the company and stayed at the helm of Forspoken, for example. The trajectory of that game would have probably been immensely different than how it ended up.
I was going to say, bringing up Forspoken, this is a good example of a game where can't be Final Fantasy for some reason, and they're desperately trying to chase new audiences, and they screwed up. Because it's important to know, we're talking about, the Game of Thrones inspired game arrived too late. Well, even in filmmaking, where you can make a film in 1.5 to 2 years, if you chase trends, stuff goes away instantaneously. Even 1.5 is too slow to not look cringy, chasing after some kind of trend, to not look like you're going, how do you do, fellow kids? my statement on chase new fans is not so much just like ignore old fans, don't try to service old fans at all, because your greatest financial success recently came from Remake, which was entirely about servicing old fans. And FF14 is a self-professed Final Fantasy theme park. Here's the problem. I remember distinctly a bunch of presentations they gave ahead of Final Fantasy XV's release where they said, Final Fantasy, a challenger once again.
Yeah, I remember that.
They seemed to recognize that they had been humbled in some way. They seemed to recognize that the series had fallen off of a pedestal that it was once on. It wasn't making the sales that it once was. It didn't have the clout that it once did. However, in retrospect, looking at the big picture, I think they thought they were challenging for the number 1 spot again. They were not. They were challenging for like the number 10 spot. And they were targeting wrong. And this is going to be a bit of a generalization. But when people are successful in a particular way, like if they have a really outsized success doing one thing, they try to do it again. Final Fantasy was an enjoyable, pseudo-successful series in Japan before 7. Final Fantasy VI's release on the SNES was considered, it wasn't even worth localizing it and releasing it internationally because it didn't make enough money. Then 10 million units, Final Fantasy VII. Why did it sell that well? Because it looks like a movie. Because it looks like the most sophisticated, expensive thing that's ever been made. And it wasn't just the winner for RPGs, it was the winner for video games. It was number 2 on the whole console behind Gran Turismo. So, obviously, that's what we need to chase forever. No. Because you guys can't do that anymore. Ryan, on your YouTube VOD, I'm going to ask you to do something for me. I'm going to ask you to do a little edit for me, okay?
Okay, hit me.
I want you to put up the Titan Lost fight from FF16. Wow. That's amazing. It's
15,
so big, and you're running around. It's so impressive, right? It's so cool. Look at this. Okay, now I want you to put up the train crash from Call of Duty World War II from 8 years ago. For anybody who doesn't know the clip I'm talking about, it is like the stupid Super 8 train crash that goes on for 7 years, and the cars flying everywhere and flipping around, and the character miraculously not getting hit. It is dumb. It is a very dumb scene. It is also, for the type of person who's going to be impressed by, oh my god, the scale, it's more impressive than that Titan fight. And it lasts 5 seconds instead of 15 minutes. And it was in a game that releases annually every year.
Yeah. Very efficient pipeline.
You cannot, Square, look me in the eyes. You cannot compete on that level anymore. You cannot sell your games on the basis of their visuals. It's not going to happen. Just a month ago, Space Marine 2 came out. Now, however much money Warhammer makes, I think we will all agree that Space Marine is not a marquee first-place video game franchise. And that is a game built around eye-melting, oh my god, those are all real enemies. Oh, those are all real enemies, and they're all coming at me! That's a genuine thrill. I've watched a ton of seasoned game-liker streamers get legitimately excited about the tech on display in Space Marine 2, and it's an exciting, visceral gameplay moment. I've watched a lot of people play 15 and Final Fantasy 16, and a lot of them liked the games, and a lot of them went, wow, this is cool. None of them have ever went, boy, I sure am glad I bought a PS5 or PS4 Pro for this. Boy, wow, howdy. I can't believe how good this looks. Nobody said that. You need to stop. You need to stop trying to get that first place spot back. You are never going to get there. If we rank the video game franchises that are popular right now, I hate to break this to you. I'm really sorry. You're not going to like this. Sonic Frontiers sold 3 million units. You guys are on the level of or below Sonic now. You may not want to hear that, Square, but you are. The kids like Sonic. The adults like Sonic. Sonic has successful console games, mobile phone games, a comic book series, a feature film series, TV shows. You are losing to Sonic the Hedgehog. And I need you to accept that. You are not challenging Call of Duty. You are not challenging, I don't know, Grand Theft Auto. You are challenging Sonic, and you are challenging Persona. You are challenging Yakuza. You need to pull back. You are not up here anymore. You aren't even challenging for up here anymore. You are challenging down here. This is your arena. You need to be releasing a new game in the Final Fantasy series every 3 years with a different vision. You need a turn-based game. You poached the guy from Capcom. You can't not make another Devil May Cry game. Creative Business Unit 1 needs to keep doing exactly what they are doing for Final Fantasy 17 or 18, because the design of Remake and Rebirth is great. And then you need another team making much smaller, really focused, story-driven games. But all of these games need to scale back. You are setting your sights way too high. The things you are prioritizing are not selling units. You are making critical strategy mistakes.
Very, very, very well spoken. I'll just chime in on that, and then we'll go on to the next topic, which I think is very aligned with what you were just talking about there. And what you were saying about, no longer competing with like the very big guys, and you mentioned Persona in particular, which is a really great case study, right? Because, you had Persona 3, which did pretty well, definitely saved Atlas at the time. And then Persona 4 sold even more. And then Persona 5 is where things really exploded. And now Persona 5 with Royal combined and all of its re-releases combined has hit 7 million, right? And that's the same.
Yeah.
That's the same as like Final Fantasy VII Remake. And
I
Persona 5 was a lot more profitable.
Exactly. Their margin is crazy on Persona games.
Right, because if I recall correctly, the maximum number of people working on Persona 5 during the height of its development was 70 people. Yeah, it's 70
I didn't even know that.
Yeah.
Oh my god, that's amazing.
Remake, Rebirth.
That's amazing. Are you kidding me?
Like
70 people?
400 or 500 at minimum.
Yeah, like minimum 400 or 500 people. Yeah, minimum.
About 600 for 16. Yeah.
About 600 people. So 10 times the staff for Final Fantasy 16 as like, well, roughly 10 times, because 70 to 600. Almost maybe 9 times, right?
I mean, if you look at total credits of 16, it's like in the thousands.
Right.
With all the outsourcing partners and all this kind of stuff. It's significant. And obviously the company itself at Square has way more overheads than Atlas does.
Right.
And way more overheads.
And
so I do have some pushback on this. So before we move on to the next one, finish your point, Ryan, and then I do have a little bit of pushback.
Okay.
Oh, feel free to push back on me all day. I went nuts there. Attack me as much as you like.
But you first, though, Ryan. I want you to.
Yeah,
I'll
finish. I'll finish my points here. I did want to actually touch on one of your points you had made about to continue to chase the new audience. I do agree. However, I think we're in a very fragile state where they also can't risk entirely alienating their new audiences, and they have been aware of that too. However, I think that has also put them in positions where they're compromising a lot of the visions of what these games could be, too predicated on not wanting to alienate those audiences and then still alienating them anyway, right? A perfect example would be that Final Fantasy XVI should have just really leaned into pleasing action game fans. Because if that's the type of game you're going to make, then go ahead and make the best action game that you possibly can unapologetically, right? Yeah. Like, go ahead and go all in on making a great action game. However, there was way too much concern about what turn-based audience or how turn-based audiences would think about certain things. They definitely, I feel like at a later point in development, they went back in and said, we need to make this game easier because our turn-based audience isn't going to be able to play this. They're not going to like it. So we need to make it, and we need to really emphasize in the marketing that anyone can play this because of the rings of accessibility that they had there. And I don't think that most gamers ended up even needing that, because not to say that there are not people that didn't benefit from it, who need like an easy or accessibility options. was just to say that the game was easy enough that I think that players on kind of the side of the spectrum that may not be as proficient as at games could still probably beat the game on action mode.
Yeah.
No,
I actually
yeah.
tweeted like just a
Yeah.
couple of days ago about like I think one of the disappointments of that game's design is that it's in kind of a no man's land
Right.
between like very casual hack and slash and like a technical game. And like the technical freaks got Hi-Fi Rush like a few months earlier, and the casual fans have 100 other options. Even the casual RPG specific hack and slash fan has like Grand Blue Fantasy Relink.
Right.
No, and they did this too with the classic mode for remake, and devoted so much time in their marketing to be like, don't worry, you can hit the X button and the action stops. They could, if they were releasing every 2 to 3 years a pre-rendered background turn-based game, they wouldn't have to worry about this.
I completely agree. With the point on listening to fans, but don't or not, I would actually say listen to fans, but don't do exactly what they say. Fans are addressing that there is a problem, and I think that you should listen to the problem, but I don't think that you should diagnose and medicate the problem based on what fans are saying. Right? Like as a chef, maybe you may know, like the person that you're serving your food to may notice that, something about the taste of the dish is off, but you don't want to listen to someone who's not a chef tell you how to cook the dish better, because they will not give you the right advice to make a better dish. In the same vein, listen to fans when they're telling you that there's an issue here, but don't listen to them about how to solve the issue.
I agree. I completely agree. And I was being a little hyperbolic, and sometimes it's hard to tell.
Yeah, that's very extreme.
Yeah, go ahead. And if you have any pushback to that, go ahead and do that now, and then we'll move on to the next topic.
So what I'll say on that is that my biggest concern, though, is that I do think there are elements of the Final Fantasy brand that are that the particular company, the particular image that does exist, can lend itself to create and recreate prestige. And it isn't necessarily about nostalgia. It's not about like a hero with a big sword. It's not, about any particular, any particular graphical style, other than I do think Final Fantasy benefits from being at the top of the visual game. It cannot look like other series. So I hear you when you're saying things like you need to lower your sights to Atlas. I don't think that's right. I don't think lowering your sights is the right mindset, and I don't think Atlas or Persona is even the right combo. There are things Persona does that's really good, or that Atlas does. Like looking, for instance, the dev cycles and looking what's in. Like if you play the Metaphor demo is out right now, and I've had some time with Metaphor personally, and I can tell you that came right in time for Freerin to start being popular. Like it is very relevant to what's popular right now in like Japanese anime, and how that's really like somewhat aligned with teens and 20-year-olds in America of a certain type that will invest in fandoms, and fandom investors are a great audience to have, people that generate a fandom. Final Fantasy has fandom, don't get me wrong, but it's always strived to be a general title that sort of supersedes fandom, right? It is not reliant on fandom. And Persona has generated fandom by hitting wide things like anime and stuff like that. And so I think it does a ton of stuff right. But I still think the better target, if you're going to try and compete in somebody's level, is still Capcom. I think Square Enix and Capcom need to be the thing that are driving brands forwards. And I'm more interested in what Resident Evil is doing with its brand as sort of like a metric for the good way to handle a prestige Japanese brand. And some of the things that they're doing include like getting rid of the numbers. And I've brought that up. And I think that there's something to be said about kind of reconceptualizing the way that people see you. Like new people know, like they play Village, and we as fans all know that that's 8 because we see the little 8 in there. And they've done something similar with Monster Hunter Wilds. There's a little 6 in there, but that's something too that I think really Final Fantasy needs to start to do to generate prestige. And there's drawbacks, and you guys can bring that up and move on to the next topic, but I'll have some pushback on the drawbacks.
I want to be very clear about what I was saying about you're competing with Persona. Because as people in the chat are pointing out, but even though it was 70 people, Persona games still take years and years to make. Somebody making a comment about no, Square is obviously way bigger than Atlas is. I want to be clear when I make that comparison. I mean what Square envisions themselves as and their popularity. The fandom for FF is more or less actively shrinking. The fan base for Persona, which I think we would all agree is not even arguably, everything about it, when you describe it on paper, is the more niche title. It is growing. That was the point that I was making.
Yeah.
And part of why it's able to do that is because of not just the quality of the games, but the number of the way that they've organized their spin-offs. As much as us big fans, we can go, oh my god, another Joker game. There is they are making a decent amount of stuff. And also, I saw someone talking about, again, but that Persona game takes 7 years to make. Persona games are also 120 hours long. If Final Fantasy wants to not be for a niche audience, if it wants to be for a broad audience, they need to make games that are 25 hours long. I don't sell me
potentially. I mean, I'm gonna counter that with CD Projekt
not all
Red
of them.
there.
Some of them.
Okay. So
I think
I counter that with Baldur's Gate 3 just this last year.
Yeah. I think one of the big things that you've both highlighted though is it does come down to IP management. Capcom are obviously the poster child for this in terms of how they're managing not just Resident Evil but all of their IP library. Pretty much all of them are at the peak of their powers right now. But Sega also should not be discounted here because they have also been going through the same kind of restoration. Going back, Sonic was, I know it was kind of a joke here, but Sonic was, Sonic 06 is a huge meme and it's taken them a long time to recover from that, but the movie has done a ton of goodwill.
Hundreds,
and they've now got the Prime series. Sonic as an IP is not a joke anymore. It's an actual prominent IP people care about. It's mass market. You go out on the I have kids. People are still wearing Sonic backpacks. It's still a very, very relevant IP. And Frontiers was essentially, by their own admission, a tech demo. I'd imagine the follow-up to Frontiers is going to sell way more than what Frontiers did, and the game will be significantly better. Persona, obviously, incredible IP management. Like a Dragon, incredible IP management. And that's one of the things that Final Fantasy and Square Enix in general has really struggled with. And this is not a Final Fantasy problem. You can apply this to almost all of the IPs that Square Enix house, whether it's Dragon Quest, it's Kingdom Hearts, it's Nier. None of them are being handled particularly well. I'd say Nier is the only one that still, the Stellar Blade Nier crossover is one of the most viewed trailers from the State of Play yesterday. But where is the next Nier product? Nobody knows who it's probably the most bankable IP they actually have right now. And they're doing nothing with it. But if you look at the recent the report where Kiryu is very transparent about their plan, one of the main strategies he has said is that they are actually going to create an IP department, a division within the company like Capcom have, like Sega have, like Namco Bandai have, that actually looks at the IP they own, how they are going to build them out, and how they are going to use the different avenues available to them. The super ironic thing about this is that's exactly what Yuichi Wada proposed 20 years ago, doing. Managing the IPs, actually building something out that is greater than the sum of its parts, and having all these things leveraged. And it's exactly what 15 did they didn't do it very well because it was the first time they were ever really doing it. There was no blueprint for them to follow. But, Kingsglaive was a very, very expensive marketing asset, but still managed to generate, I think, about 30 or 40 million in terms of box office revenue and DVD and Blu-ray sales and Netflix deals, etc. That movie, the trailer even just was published on the Sony website, by the visuals alone, was viewed by 6-7 million people. Brotherhood, an off-the-cuff anime that they produced, was a huge, huge success. And imagine if they'd done something similar for Remake, just as a random marketing thing. You get little origin stories of younger versions of Cloud, Tifa, Barrett. People would have absolutely loved that, and it would have been so accessible for the general audience. Yeah, someone's mentioned the Nier anime as well. They're doing a good job with that, but it's also because someone else is in charge of that IP, Mr. Yoko Taro, who's very, very good at understanding. You mentioned Kojima. He is also incredibly good at understanding what people want to see from him, how to be relevant. The stuff he's doing right now with Metaphor is just completely random, but it's probably some of the most stuffed, most watched marketing activity they've actually got going on right now.
And he's promoting himself as much as he has Metaphor.
Yeah, exactly. He's put 2B in absolutely every single game known to man, and people love it. It's ridiculous. But I think a lot of it does, come back to that IP management. They don't have that level of control anymore, and Final Fantasy's IP doesn't have the same kind of strength that it used to have. Going back to the Tabata thing about being a challenger, one of the things that he did mention was that when he was asked to take over the project, the sales expectations that he was given were 3.5 million copies. Around what 16 has managed to accomplish is where the company actually felt the brand was. So their own estimations were where the brand actually sat in the hierarchy was probably about right. Tabata somehow, through the power of whatever, managed to massively outperform what was expected from that game to the nth degree. And it's some kind of miracle. I mean, it's basically one of the best-selling games Square Enix has ever produced in the history of the company. And, if 7 hadn't been peddled out to every single system known to man, it would be the best-selling Final Fantasy game ever made. Which, for the quality of the game, the barometer there is difficult to kind of reconcile with. But I think that's where Square kind of, with Remake, I think they made a misstep in terms of they saw the reveal trailer in 2015, the most watched trailer pretty much in the history of gaming. It was the most anticipated game that probably could have been announced and people wanted. But the things they did between 2015 reveal and 2020 release just kept eking away at how much people actually wanted it. And by the time it actually came, those audiences, all the goodwill they brought up, all the excitement, it then just went back to, okay, core audience. They're going to pick the game up, and maybe we'll get some residual fans as a result. Just they're interested, they want to know what it's about, those kind of things. And then obviously the first month of the launch came out, and people were like, do I really want to get into this? Right. It doesn't seem like it's that accessible. There's people are complaining about the story and all these different things. They made it easy to not want to try the game. And even with it coming on PlayStation Plus and all those different things, it doesn't seem to have massively increased the player base, because Rebirth sold half from what we understand.
I still think that's a matter of, you're releasing it on a different SKU. I'm interested to see what happens when Rebirth comes to PC. I think it's going to get a not insignificant bump on PC.
Yeah, it would be interesting to see how many units Remake would have sold if it actually hit that 2018 target that it was originally kind of setting.
Same for 16 as well, right?
I think that would have actually had tremendous upward momentum for that title in particular. I could have seen it actually crossing over that 10 million threshold pretty easily.
I'm
But I
gonna,
mean,
say,
with-
I'm gonna say one more thing, and then I promise I'll
Okay,
shut up. in
really
30 minutes.
fast, really fast,
Really
because
fast.
we do need
I
to
was
move
just
on.
going to say, to
Yeah.
defend my honor on my comment previously about runtimes, I'm not saying all Final Fantasy games should be 25 hours, obviously. Like Rebirth or whatever. Part 3 is going to be long, obviously. I was proposing making, pre-rendered background turn-based games. Those should be long, obviously. I meant if you're going to make something like Final Fantasy XVI, where you're trying to appeal to action gamers, and your core sales tagline is, we've created a game like a nonstop action roller coaster, then it should be 20 hours. Like if that's what if you're trying to grab a new segment of the market, how long is that game? 80 hours. I'll play something else. I'm not saying there aren't successful long games. Yakuza's successful. Obviously, you mentioned Baldur's Gate 3, though Baldur's Gate 3 is what we call a statistical outlier.
Like Final Fantasy 15.
Yes. But anyway, that was all I was going to say on that. I'm not saying all Final Fantasy games should be short. I'm saying if you're trying to attract new people, you need to lower the bar to entry, and one of those things is, how long is that game? 80 hours? Who's got that kind of time? That's all. That's all I meant by that.
For sure, and I think that game
Also,
would have
as
been
a correction,
better paced. Go on.
As a correction around 15, people are saying that there's no way they expected the game to sell 3.5 million copies with all the marketing budget. That was the initial goalpost. Tabata said, actually, I can hit 5, but I'm going to aim for 10. He was like, no way we should be thinking that lowly of the brand, which is where the Final Fantasy disease quotes all came from, because he saw how down on the franchise their own company and their own employees were. Like, their expectations were so low. He just really wanted to try and do something to motivate and show them, this is possible. We can do this. We can do this, people.
Yeah. Okay. Let's move on to the next topic here. This is a really juicy one, I feel like. I'm actually going to bundle these two together in our outline here, because I even noted that they just naturally follow each other anyway, because they definitely will. And I think that a lot of people have been having discourse about this on social media. So I think that this is a great forum to actually discuss it. Final Fantasy is often said to radically change each time, though historically, this is a bit of a half-truth. Final Fantasy 1 through 10-2 have a strong number of overlapping elements, and all games that Square Enix would call command RPGs. This is kind of the way they group the turn-based RPGs, like pure turn-based, like 1 through 3 or 10, and the ATV games together. Final Fantasy always has, indeed, changed certain mechanics, style, story, characters, and those sorts of things. But during that age, that golden era that people call, they kept the core identity, the core gameplay identity, shared across these games. And so you could always kind of look at a game and tell, just from the combat mechanics, oh, this is Final Fantasy, from the menus and these sorts of things. You can make an argument even that 12 and 13, though divisive in some ways, still attempted to evolve the core FF gameplay loop. Nowadays, however, mainline Final Fantasies aren't even in the same genre as one another. Like Final Fantasy 15 and 16, those are games that are not in the same genre at all. 16 could be argued as purely a hack and slash with a level up mechanic rather than just an RPG. There's an argument to be made there. All of this is to ask, do you think Final Fantasy has an identity problem? And do you believe that they should be iterating on these games like Rebirth and 16?
I'm going to say yes and no. The caveat being that obviously 11 and 14 are also in different genres. They made a very clear choice back when 11 was coming out that it should be a numbered game and the genre should not define or matter, essentially. I think the difference here, though, is that those games, Final Fantasy 1 through 10-2, were pretty much all made by the same team. The only exception being 9, really. And so it made sense that there was a lot of similarity in there. Where things started to get a bit more muddy is where they introduced more teams. And obviously, the original plan around this was that you had the 9 team, the 10 team, the MMO team, and then you had the Matsuno team, essentially, all kind of tasked with coming up with their own vision of what Final Fantasy should be, all creating games on a similar pipeline that were iterative and expansive. It all kind of fell apart. That team structure just dissolved. Obviously Matsuno quit. The team completely goes. The Final Fantasy 12 team is gone. The MMOs continued, obviously, but 14 had its disastrous launch, then had to essentially be reborn. That's kind of still going. The Final Fantasy IX team essentially was dissolved. So all of the retro creators, like Ito, obviously moved on to 12 and has since disappeared. You have people like Shibuya and Kazuhiko Aoki, like all of the kind of like or Itahana as well, like that team essentially that worked on 9 kind of got dissolved as well into other projects. You know, like some of the Crystal Chronicles, some of them like Dimensions. Tokita joined Asano's team. So then we were left with, okay, we've got the kind of the 7, 8, and 10 team essentially, who are, you know, there is still stuff inherited from the older games through there. You know, Katase did work on 5 and onwards, but they Katase stepped down, right? So you've got that visionary. He's passed the torch over to Toriyama, who's got a very different vision about what Final Fantasy should be in comparison to that. And then you've got 15, completely different team, which we're essentially making mobile games, and then we're like, now make a whole console game and salvage this action RPG and turn it into a mainline game that was supposed to be a spin-off. 16 completely different teams. So I don't think it's so much that Final Fantasy has an identity problem. It's that the teams themselves don't really know what Final Fantasy is to each other. There's nothing wrong with Final Fantasy being whatever it wants to be. It's just that we haven't really had that kind of consistent path or message. The only team that's really been able to do that is Katase's team with, you know, 10, 10-2, 13 trilogy, and then we're on the remake and rebirth now, and you can kind of see the benefits of when that happens. You know, many people regard 13.2 as a superior game to 13, even if the sales didn't necessarily match it, because a lot of people were soured. Rebirth is in exactly the same position. You know, almost everyone feels, not everyone, but almost everyone feels that Rebirth is a superior game to remake, but the sales don't match because some people were soured by the first one. Had they chosen, though, to, obviously they've done what they've done for an attempted profitability reason to cut down costs, and I'm sure they envision that the remake trilogy, for example, will probably go on to be one of the best-selling kind of overarching properties. And it collectively, once the third part comes out and they start doing triple compilations of all the games, it's going to sell collectively in the sort of 15 million plus range, I would imagine. But I think had they said, like, okay, so Rebirth's a single game, Remake's a single game, we're going to make Rebirth a new IP or a new Final Fantasy game, we'd be in a different situation now. We'd be having a different conversation about what has happened. And I think that's kind of the struggle that is there, that we have a situation where, okay, Tabata makes Final Fantasy 15. Well, he now wants to go and work on a new IP. He doesn't want to work on Final Fantasy anymore, and now he's left the company. His team's completely dissolved. We've got Yoshida's worked on 16. I think he's also said he doesn't want to work on another offline Final Fantasy game. Who knows if he will or not. And he was pretty open about the fact that he only did this one because Matsuda was like, can you make a Final Fantasy game? Please, really, can you do it? It wasn't like him saying, I really want to work on an offline Final Fantasy game. So, like, we're just in this weird situation where, like, of course people want to work on a Final Fantasy game, but they also don't want to work on an offline Final Fantasy game. There's not really a plan that is basically kind of like, you know, the Call of Duties, like the Yakuza, Like a Dragon franchise series. They've just got it nailed down in terms of, this is the plan. These are the games that are coming out. We've got Like a Dragon mainline, which are now turn-based and appeal to this fan base. We've got the Pirates spin-off and like the man who lost his name, which are the action ones, which appeal to this demographic. You've got the Sonic, where you've got like the Frontiers, and that which appeal to the kind of the more newer audiences. But they're also working on updating Generations, and they had Mania and stuff for the slightly older ones. There's a plan in terms of how they want to build the audience and the fan bases out. Whereas Final Fantasy hasn't really had that plan for essentially since Sakaguchi left, when he had that vision for the 4 different Final Fantasy core audiences or development groups that were going to work on their own projects and build out their own kind of niches and cater to their own audiences. Once he left, it's just kind of been a free-for-all in terms of, I mean, yeah, we've talked about it before, in terms of the Final Fantasy brand manager. What does that role actually mean? I mean, there was 5-6 years ago, there was the founding of the Final Fantasy Committee, which was like this group of people that were supposed to oversee and approve all Final Fantasy based products. And then we still ended up with tons of subpar things happening that are just completely random all over the place. No real sense of IP management. So yeah, I think there is a problem, but it's not necessarily the brand's fault that this problem has existed, because Final Fantasy has always been quite adaptive. But in the olden days, through those initial foundational days and the golden era, etc., they had to be iterative. They would leverage what the skills they had, how they developed games, and they would kind of tack stuff on that they thought was going to push things forward, and they'd remove stuff that just didn't work. A lot of the systems are the same. A lot of the characters have the same traits to them. You can compare protagonists from like 6 and 7, and you can see that they're very similar. Uematsu used the same thematic melodies in different pieces like throughout the years. It's like there was a lot of repetition and recycling of stuff, and they just lost that in the Square Enix era because they just didn't really know how to keep things on a consistent pipeline. They didn't have the resources. They decided to focus on other things, and it's just kind of, we're in a situation I don't think anyone necessarily wants to be in, but it does seem as though it shouldn't be too difficult to fix as long as they have that control.
Very well said. Would any of you other boys like to chime in on this?
Yeah, I agree. I don't think there was a word that Daryl said that I don't agree with. And the identity is really adaptive. And so we will say that there's an identity problem when something underperforms in it, right? Because that's how adaptive the identity is. And regardless of how action-oriented 16 chose to be, if the game got over a 90 on Metacritic and sold 5 million copies and had a seat at the table at TGA, we wouldn't be having this conversation about them having an identity problem, because one of the words...
That would be the new identity.
Yeah, that would be the new identity. That's the deal. It's adaptive, right? And when you hear even the developers talk about what is Final Fantasy, they'll say it's the best thing. Like Jacob was talking about, we want to be the best thing in the world. Unfortunately, that is the thing that is harder to separate from the brand Final Fantasy than chocobos, prestige. So if you do legitimately say, hey, we've got to scale back on our need for prestige, what you're saying is, really, you're scaling back on your need for Final Fantasy, okay? Because it's supposed to be the best, right? It's supposed to be this thing that really sets trends that the other things look up to. That is more quintessential to Final Fantasy than chocobos. And what's been happening is that over the last 6 mainline titles, people don't feel that way. And as that number gets closer to 20, it's going to feel even more and more like the bad outweighs the good. Like that this has lost its ability to be a prestige title. And you could argue that because of the dev cycles, it already has, because the period of time between now is shorter than the period between
what kind of losing
the
you?
fact that we're on 16. Uh-oh.
Okay,
Okay, somebody else talk. I'll be
I
back
can-
on that point.
I can take over that though, because if you go back to what Sakaguchi was attempting to do, he envisioned this problem, right? He had 4 separate teams
Yeah.
working on Final Fantasy games, and to Jacob's point around how these other studios, like, I mean, Ubisoft just churn Assassin's Creed games out. They've slowed down slightly, and I know they're not in exactly the best example right now based on what is happening. But there was a period of time where they were able to put games out, and even when Brotherhood came out, I was like, there is no way they're going to be able to make this game interesting to me. It's too quick. Like, what are they going to do? And then it comes out, and it's like, this game is amazing somehow. And they completely blew my mind in terms of how they were able to do that in such a short period of time. But Call of Duty did it because they had cycling teams. They had Infinity Ward and they had Treyarch, and then they brought in a third team as well to try and make sure that they were able to sustain things. And that's the way you get around it. It's like they just released 16 and 7 Rebirth literally on top of each other when they probably didn't need to. I know that that's probably not what they wanted to do either. But ultimately, it could have been a situation where, okay, you have 2 years between games. There were 2 teams working on projects that were high quality. You would have enough time to let them breathe and build up on their own. But you could add a third team to that as well, if you wanted to work on something else that is kind of adjacent, that wants to build a new arm for what Final Fantasy needs to be. I mean, essentially, you do have that with the MMO team already, like a third team, which happened to be the same team as the other team. But like the theory is very much there. They just haven't coordinated, and it's one of the kind of like the massive, like, crazy things that came out of that investment report was that they revealed that the business divisions previously had 0 communication with each other. They all worked in complete isolation, essentially competing against each other. And Kiryu has said, okay, we're not going to do that anymore. We're all going to collaborate now. We're going to talk to each other about scheduling. We're going to talk to each other about resource management and marketing and how we can actually help each other build as a company and not be counterproductive.
Very well said.
Yeah.
Jacob, you look like you have... it's Clark.
No,
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Clark.
Yeah.
I just wanted to. I mean, really, it's hard to tack on to what Daryl says because he's such a fountain. But I completely agree that the hands not talking to each other, is not a problem, or is not a solution to an identity crisis. Having disconnected units is really going to hurt any sense of identity that you have. And speaking of, like, Assassin's Creed and how effective the Ezio trilogy was, and just honestly everything that involved Desmond, that whole period of time, the dev cycles, the solution to that was just unsustainable now. Like, you can't really do that anymore in games. It used to be something that you could feasibly just throw humans at the problem, and that is how you do that with, like, the Madden games and stuff like that, is you just throw manpower, cost, expense. But there is not a market that can sustain that anymore. I think people think that there is, but like Jacob talked about, the console market's very different now, and the youth is young people are playing mobile games, and they're playing these games that are really attention span driven, right? So that market,
and that's where you need the ecosystem, right? It's not just about having tons of games coming out. It's like Capcom, again, masters of this. Like, they just announced the Devil May Cry anime series, which I'm sure is a precursor to a new Devil May Cry being announced. Like, they did it with Dragon's Dogma as well. They've done a fantastic job of bringing, and League of Legends did a great job. Dota 2, like, there are so many of these crossover anime series. Resident Evil also does a fantastic job. They don't all land, but since the kind of the revival of 7, there have been, I don't know, like 6 movies like they've got the CG movies, they've got the kind of live action movies, they've got the Netflix shows, they've got the Netflix anime, they've got countless like books being produced. There's so many things or so many ways you can get into the franchise and learn more about it, and then think, oh, I might be. Obviously, in the gaming, you've got the two completely separate arms. You've got the new games, you've got the remakes. People that are playing the remakes will now be way more excited about Resident Evil 9 when it comes out because those remakes exist.
And
they never played Resident Evil
saying,
6, so they don't know it was bad.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And it's been 10 years, so like it's good again. But what you were saying though, about the pipeline, right? So what's a little bittersweet about this is that, we've heard rumors, and we try not to talk too much about rumors, Daryl and I in particular, but, there's been rumors of all of these things existing in some form for Final Fantasy, these cross-marketing things, these things that develop the brand and the identity of Final Fantasy that just kind of fall through. Like there just isn't
the 9 anime, right?
Final
Fantasy 9 anime that just
I'm not I'm not even going to talk about that. I don't want to think about it. It hurts to think about that, right? Like, but that kind of stuff, there was this precedent for it with Brotherhood, which people did watch. Like there was even there was
millions of people watched that.
Yeah, people watched that. There is value to that stuff for the brand, and a lot of that stuff seems to have been thought about and then abandoned. So again, this isn't about brand management. This is about resource management to make those brand management ideas actually materialize. That's the thing that we're not seeing happen.
One of the interesting things around that is that shortly after Remake was announced, Katase did an interview and he specifically mentioned Tabata. And, the active time reports he used to do were incredibly valuable for building community, being transparent about what was happening. And he just flat out said, I'm not interested in doing that. I don't care.
So this is Katase's fault.
It's just the different creators have different ways of working, right? And I think, if you're a fan of Nomura's games, that's not the way things work. But with Tabata and Yoshida, there was a very different expectations set in terms of how they operate. Yoshida does his letters from the producer live. He's been doing them for years. People love that interaction. They love the ability to see what's going on. Tabata didn't always bring good news in his active time reports, and sometimes when Stella was cut and he had to explain it, he was upfront about we're doing this, we're making this decision. If you're not happy with it, I'm really sorry, but we're going to try our best to please you. With Remake, so much stuff happened during that 5-year period, and all we would get is brief snippets from Nomura appearing at a random conference in Monaco somewhere where he gives like a really small update, which is cryptic and doesn't really help to explain what's going on. And then you just get a massive bombardment of stuff like in the 9 months before launch of like, here is absolutely everything you need to know about this game. All of a sudden, like it's like just care, please, just care. And it's like the marketing doesn't really work that way anymore. It's difficult to connect with people in that way, which is why obviously Remake ended up just kind of shrinking down to that original audience who were going to buy it anyway.
Very well said. Jacob, did you have anything to touch on with this topic?
Before I say anything, I actually want to ask a quick question to the room. What is our time frame? We didn't talk about if anybody has a hard out.
I did actually mention it, and I guess no one really saw it.
Then I just wasn't paying attention.
Yeah, I basically said like the original plan was to go for like 2 hours, but I was like, I could basically go for like another hour and a half myself. So it's just up to everyone else. So if you guys have the time, we can keep going. If anyone needs to leave, yeah, you can dip out at any time.
I know it's pretty late for you, Daryl. How are you?
Yeah, Daryl is kind of
It is pretty late. Well, how much more conversation topics do we have to go through? I think
we had a few more items, but I was also going to ask Ryan, do you want to abandon the group exercise that you and I talked about, or do we want to slot that in instead of one of the questions, maybe?
For the sake of
because that group exercise would kind of follow what we just did.
Okay, yeah. For the sake of time, I think we'll have to probably not go with it. I think we only have like two other topics.
Then
I
guess I'll talk briefly about the identity.
Yeah. So go ahead. Yeah, question. Go ahead, and then we'll get to those two topics, and I'll also chime in with some things I have to say.
Yeah. So you haven't. This is your show, and you haven't talked a whole lot. Do you want to go first, for that matter, Ryan? I've talked a
lot. Sure. I would actually love to talk about this. I think that I mean, I definitely want to give you guys like a good platform to talk about this in particular, because I think I've talked about this quite a bit over the past few days. So I think that my audience has a bit, they kind of know what to expect from me. That being said, when it comes to Final Fantasy having a sort of identity problem, I guess what I personally identify as the identity problem is sort of like there isn't a focused type of game that's being made, such that if you like the last game, you have a really strong chance of not liking the next game, and then the dev times are so long, it'll be an increasingly longer time between the next time you get something that you may possibly be into. So let's take a look at, say, for example, all of the new fans that got introduced to Final Fantasy XVI for the first time. Maybe Final Fantasy XVI's hack and slash gameplay really resonated with you. There is no other Final Fantasy game like that. And also, considering that the current plan is to just do a different thing each time, there's a good chance that there probably won't be another Final Fantasy game like that. And so when you don't even have consistency within the same subgenre of game that you're making, how can people be like, oh, I'm looking forward to the next thing, when the next thing is also going to be something entirely separate and different in every single fundamental way, right? It's one of the things that makes the Soulsborne games, for example, work, right? Like you can have a Souls game in Japan.
Recycle.
Right, exactly. But guess what, man? I haven't, at the very least, heard anyone in mass quantities saying, gosh, I'm so tired of FromSoft. Oh, another Soulsborne game.
Well, also because they managed to make minor iterations and changes on their formula every single time, basically.
Yeah, exactly.
People don't like it when you bring up Dark Souls 2. But like even today, if you include that in there, none of the Dark Souls trilogy are really all that much like each other. Once you really get
Dark Souls 2 had to live or had to die so that Elden Ring could live, because the guy who directed that was co-director on Elden Ring.
And like Sekiro is a very different beast from Bloodborne, which is a different beast from
what you were describing, Ryan, is basically what Asano has done with his mini team, right? You know, they worked on Bravely Default, Octopath Traveler, Triangle Strategy, Live Alive Remake, right? They are very different games.
Yeah.
In terms of different genres, like different ways of playing things out. But the audience knows that they're going to enjoy the game because it's by that team.
Right.
And they put out those games with a very consistent pipeline. And so there's always something that they can roughly look forward to. We don't quite know what they've got. Well, they're working on the Dragon Quest 3 and 1 and 2 2D HD remakes right now. We don't know what they've got beyond that. But like Triangle Strategy is probably the most out there game they could have done in terms of like concept and also naming convention. And they still managed to have it sell around 1 to 2 million copies. Like
precisely.
It's such a commendable thing, but people did it because they were like, it's kind of like the in Asano we trust, essentially. They know that because it's part of that team, that it's going to be good quality. And Bravely Default 2, they deviated a lot in that game in terms of graphical style and things like that. It's still sold. It's still sold.
Right.
And I'm sure with whatever they do next, they'll have a similar mindset in terms of iterating on what they know works, introducing some fun new things, seeing if it works too, and if it works, keep it, and if it doesn't, well, we'll revert to something else, because they haven't used the Bravely Default graphical style in any of their other projects yet.
Yeah, very few battle systems, very few. The most well-received version of it is the first initial draft, right? Imagine World Without Cage 2, DMC 3 or 5, Bloodborne, games that are wildly considered to be the very best in their genre. They would not exist if they did not build on what came before them.
Yeah.
And so the idea that Final Fantasy can survive on continuously pushing out first drafts, right? Continuously, making things that don't really, reach their full potential. Continuously, in perpetuity. I do not know a single studio, AAA studio in particular, that's able to effectively do that. In fact, most of these AAA
Baldur's
studios...
Gate 3.
Yeah, exactly, right? Like Baldur's Gate 3.
Divinity Original Sin 2, like they worked on a lot of things throughout those games, and then they were able to tackle Baldur's Gate 3, and also had a massive early access too.
It appeals to an idea in us that this idea of radically changing each time is sort of a virtue. But when you factor in the practicality of AAA development, what it requires, how long it takes, how long research and development takes, putting these things together, how cost inefficient it can be. When you put all of these elements together, you quickly realize how vastly impractical and how little it actually offers. Innovation is good, and we should continue to want FF to innovate. The problem that I see is that it is really difficult to innovate when you aren't doing it in a defined space, when you aren't in a place saying, okay, well, we're doing this type of game, but we're doing new types of things with this.
You need restrictions.
Right. And also as well, it's not necessarily like, and this isn't to say anything bad about these games, but say like something like 15 or 16, for the most part, the structure of those games is not necessarily something that we just simply haven't seen before. Those game styles are new for Final Fantasy, but they're not necessarily new for the broader spectrum of video games, right? Like 16 in terms of hack and slashes, I mean, most of the elements that you see in that game, minus a few nuances, is generally done within the hack and slash genre, same with 15 in the open world genre. And so it really depends too, the scope of innovation. Are we talking about innovating just within Final Fantasies? Never done that before? Or are we talking about video games at large have never done this before? And I think that Final Fantasy has done new things for FF, but I don't think that maybe newer games have really pushed. No one has really done this in video games. Where I think you actually get that is from having a craft, having a type of game. You mentioned Baldur's Gate 3, Daryl. That's actually a really good space. Part of the reason that game gets to be so innovative and genre defining is because they were able to build a certain thing and then execute on it to its fullest potential. And just unfortunately, due to how expensive and complex that making these AAA systems, again, innovating within a certain type of game would also save them a tremendous amount of money on just doing the R&D for these new battle systems as well. And so it would actually result in what I believe more innovative, more genre defining, more challenger type games, as they called it, than it would just simply trying to do what they think will attract the most number of people.
Yeah, I mean, like the best case for that is Assassin's Creed, essentially, because they reinvented the game by introducing a new setting, new character, new world, etc., but kept a lot of mechanics the same. But then Black Flag was, they suddenly invented like sea combat out of nowhere, and everyone was like, "Oh, this is amazing." But also, I'm really curious to see how
they had something to build off of in the first place. They had the rest of the game already figured out, so they could leap in and make a robust ship combat open world system on top of what they already had, because they trusted what they had.
And like, you know, it's also super interesting the route they've taken with Ghost of Yotai. Like, I think everyone expected them to make Ghost of Tsushima 2, which they haven't done. It's set, you know, 300-400 years in the future, completely different world, essentially, new protagonists, new characters, and they've done essentially what we want Final Fantasy to do. They've I'm sure they're going to keep a lot of the core gameplay mechanics there that people liked from the original. They're probably going to innovate in ways that we can't anticipate because they've had a long time to think about what they can do to evolve the mechanics and push things forward. But ultimately, it's still going to be a Ghost of game. But they've also set a precedent moving forward now that, you know, the franchise isn't Ghost of Tsushima, it's Ghost, essentially. And they can kind of do whatever they want with it. But now, to your point in terms of like earlier about what is a Final Fantasy game, that game is very much a Ghost game, right? From everything they showed off, you could probably show people that didn't know it was called Ghost of Yotai instead, but they would be able to very clearly identify that as a successor to Ghost of Tsushima based on just what they showed. But so much of it has changed. But it hasn't changed, and I think that's one of the things that, you know, the older games very much clearly had. We were joking about the other day, Ryan, in terms of, you know, Final Fantasy 1 through 4. A lot of them use the same sprites. You know, the warrior is in Final Fantasy 1. It's also Firion's model in Final Fantasy 2. Then they reused it again in Final Fantasy 3, and then you've got the knight in 3, which is essentially the same sprite for Cecil in 4. They just changed the colors. They did a lot of things that you would be able to immediately recognize it as a Final Fantasy game. And
100%.
you know, obviously moving forward, you know, with 7, the graphical style completely changed. They brought in a new audience. They created a new identity. And then they did the same thing again with 8. We're going to go super realistic characters now, which is why, you know, there's a big connection between like 8 and 10. Like the games are very, very similar in terms of their execution. But 9 didn't resonate with those people because it was a different identity for the game. That game wasn't meant to appeal to the 7 and 8 crowd. It was meant to appeal to the 6 crowd, the 4 crowd,
right?
People that were previously there. And it did a good job of doing that. And you typically see that pattern. People like 6 and 9 in combination with each other, and they also like 12. And people like 7, 8, and 10. There are obviously crossovers there, but you know that what other companies are doing now. You know, Ghost of Yotai is, I think, a fantastic example of essentially what I would want to be happening here. You know, take Rebirth or take 16 and iterate upon it, fix the things that, you know, didn't work out. You've got the time to do that, adjust it, but put it in a new space.
Yeah, 100%.
I do want to push back a little bit on this, and it's that I think that when you say the word genre, that's a pretty meaningless term now, right? Because it would be ridiculous not to say that both Resident Evil 7 and Resident Evil 4 Remake aren't survival horror, but the difference between a first person and a third-person survival horror is as significant as, say, the difference between Final Fantasy XVI and Final Fantasy VII Remake's combat. So there is this
they
really
should appeal to the same audience.
There is this real analog line with genre where it's not digital. There is not this really clear thing that makes people want to do this, right? So another example is the gameplay style between God of War 2018 and the previous hack and slashes are so fundamentally different that it was sometimes a little bit alienating for.
But you would still call both games action adventure.
Sure.
I think you would make an argument on the Resident Evil case. It's not even just first person and third person. I would say Resident Evil 4, despite being built off the back of the same stuff, is functionally a completely different experience from Remake 2. Even though that's also third person and you play as Leon. Completely different rhythm.
Right. So there are these gameplay elements that are so significantly different between main time titles that nobody has an issue with the identity. And that's because identity is really large on a lot of these IPs. And so again, if an identity is robust enough because of the things that the company that creates the IP and propagates what we think about the IP is creating a pipeline of imagery that allows us to connect to it, nobody's going to be confused about, like nobody's going to feel really confused. Yeah, like not being able to have another, DMC Final Fantasy game if you were to enter the series at DMC or at Final Fantasy 16 is a bummer. But what it could do is it could invite people into an adjacent product like Final Fantasy VII Remake, and that could get people in love with the idea of Final Fantasy, which is this boundless prestige fantasy, high fantasy, sometimes sci-fi element title. This is the kind of thing that I'm into for a variety of different reasons. But I think the problem is that people don't know what Final Fantasy is, and I don't think that's because I don't think that's reliant specifically on the fact that gameplay mechanics are changing from system to system or from game to game. I think it's because there's not Netflix specials anymore. There's not, there's not all this stuff saying this is Final Fantasy. I can go into, like, just as an example, I can go into a Hot Topic and find Resident Evil shit. I can't find Final Fantasy stuff.
I find Kingdom Hearts stuff as well.
Yeah, and that's another thing. It's a whole other. We could have a whole other podcast just on the issues with Kingdom Hearts and brand identity and whose fault that is. It doesn't matter. Like, it kind of doesn't matter whose fault it is. It's not happening. Like, we're not seeing the stuff that makes the IP ubiquitous enough to be a prestige title. There are things that change so fundamentally from system to system or iteration to iteration that you wouldn't be able to know that they're the same had you not just heard the title or heard the creator. Maybe not a ton in the gaming space. They do exist. But like the Flaniverse is a great example. The Flanagan shows. Like, you hear that name, it's associated with a certain level of quality. That's what Final Fantasy was going for, is being associated with a certain level of quality, and that being enough to propel the brand. I remember, we had this conversation with Mike from Resident Arc, Ryan and I, and he brought up this point about going to a restaurant, and like, if you go and you order the same thing every single time, and then all of a sudden going, and then your burrito's a hamburger, feeling betrayed by that. But there is a class of people that go and they order the special. And if you go to prestige restaurants, some of them don't have menus. And part of the experience is having so much creative faith in the creators that they are going to provide you with an innovative experience.
And that's what people used to have with Square, right? It's that,
it is.
That people, like, that's why people picked up the bouncer and stuff like that.
That's
because
right.
They were like,
that's right.
I trust the brand. I know
Yeah.
that no matter what they put out, it's going to deliver. And Square as a company don't like that and this is why it's not just a Final Fantasy issue. It's Square Enix as a company. The logo comes up and people are now like, what's this going to be? It's because it could be anything, right?
Yeah.
It could be a random remake of a game that is super niche in Japan. It could be a super AAA title that's coming out of nowhere. There's no real barometer for what is going to be shown. Like, as soon as that Square Enix logo comes up, you literally have no idea what you're going to see.
Yeah. You feel such a mixture of fear and excitement,
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I do have a couple of things to say in response to that. Particularly going back to, say, like the RE4 and RE7 example. I do think that they have enough in common to still be appealing to the same audience, right? Where RE4 and RE7 arbitrarily, you can say those things are maybe one step removed from each other. They're not 10 steps removed from each other. I think that's kind of the issue that we get in here. Whereas RE4 and RE7 have enough DNA in common that if you play one, there is still a good chance that you are going to want to play the other, right? Predicated on a lot of the same sort of trappings being in there. there is, to a certain point, no overlap between certain Final Fantasy games in terms of experience, like whatsoever, right? So if you enjoy, like you enjoy
if you get certain levels of disconnect with Resident Evil, though, like you can't look at Code Veronica and Village and say, oh, this is a similar experience. Like you get far enough, but there are
there's also like Outbreak
and
Operation Raccoon City. Like they're obviously like wild spin-offs.
There are links. I would argue that 7 Remake is close enough to 16 that people are going to feel like, okay, this is the same genre, but one's really good. And I'm not going to say which one, to not upset people. Like I do think there's enough.
I don't agree. I don't agree. Personally.
7 Remake is also close enough to 7 in some regards as well. Like I think they did a fantastic job of modernizing the system and making it feel like this is how the ATB system should be, like 20 years on.
This is where
7R is closer to 16 than Code Veronica is to, Resident Evil 1.
This is okay,
by every objective measure. So
perhaps,
this is why I'm saying. This is why I'm saying if you have solid brand identity, like that's ubiquitous in a modern market, you can survive those differences.
Right.
You can survive.
I don't disagree, but going back to the 7 and 7R comparison, a lot of it is offering the same things in completely different expressions. And so you're doing a lot of the same sort of things. You may be approaching them differently. It's a completely reinvented way for you to do those things. However, it's still the same core things that the combat is playing out in a fundamental way that you would expect FF7 combat to play out. And so as a result, I feel like it is easier to accept those things, as compared to it being so far removed. Now, like you said, I agree. You go to an omakase, literally, omakase comes from the word makaseru, to trust in the chef, right? So, you have to makasete. But the thing is that games, AAA games, don't take an hour to prepare, don't take a day to prepare. They take 8 years. They take 8 years.
Absolutely.
$150 million. A lot, or more.
Yeah.
They take investors who want something with an ROI. They have all this overhead and all these factors that you don't get from being able to do something that doesn't have this tremendous amount of pressure on it, that doesn't have these sort of expectations that are kind of being layered on from the capitalist system. If that were the case, if it's something like, Annapurna, rest in peace, I wouldn't want them, to do the exact same thing. Right, because they do have that well-defined identity, and part of the reason they were able to successfully carry that out is because the fiduciary duty there, wasn't to the shareholders and wasn't like all these other sort of things. And so while what you're saying, right, also too. And while what you're saying appeals to the virtues of me and what I believe art should be, there is this craft element to video games and how long these things take to make and what type of audience and building that audience. And so, yes, it may not be like the most artistically savvy thing to do. However, it is the thing that is most practical to do. It is the thing that allows people to return and for those people to get the thing that they want. And this is always kind of what makes video games complicated. It's one of the reasons I think Kojima even said back in the day, are video games an art or a service? And surprisingly, Kojima said they're more of a service, right? And when you read into that quote, it's really that aspect of it that I'm mentioning, that Kojima has to say that it's a service. And then he follows that up by saying, but there is an artistic way in which you can deliver that service. And I think,
but what you're offering though, what you're suggesting is that they just lower the difficulty of their craft. rather than get better craftsmen.
No, that's not what I'm saying.
And I think that's the issue. I think the
that's
issue is that they
yeah.
can do this. They can maintain this identity of needing to change, but they need newer, fresher talent. They need a better identity pipeline, because the thing that you're saying Square can't do, Capcom does. And so you got to figure out why that is. And one easy solution is to lower the amount of expectations we put on Square Enix and have them make something simpler and easier.
Yeah.
Or they
Yeah.
recognize their faults and find different
Yeah.
craftsmen, younger
Yeah.
craftsmen. So I think the answer is probably somewhere in between.
Yeah, I don't know. I can personally agree that that's what Capcom's doing. I do feel like that there is plenty enough commonality between the mainline Resident Evil games post 4 that makes them feel like very predictably that I like the other one, I'll like the next one well enough, minus some nuances that they are within the same thing.
Even Monster Hunter, right? I mean,
Yeah.
the people that are helming the Monster Hunter brand have almost been there since the day one. Like they were working on like Freedom Unite and stuff. Like they've just realized how to modernize the brand and make it relevant. And part of that again goes back to that IP management. You know, they had that interesting movie, but it helped to raise the profile of Monster Hunter. They did a really good job of making the game feel like you want to play it. Like but it's still roughly the same team that are working on it, that always worked on it. They just took different approaches. And Resident Evil, yeah, I mean, like again, the people helming Resident Evil aren't necessarily young people. They worked on the original Resident Evil games in junior positions. It's just that a lot of the senior figures are no longer at Capcom, so that's the choice they have. So I think it part of Capcom's success story is definitely the collaboration aspect. I mean, pretty much every single game they put out is built on the Resident Evil engine. Like they are multifaceted teams. You know, the team that works on Resident Evil, I don't know which ones they are, but like they probably work on Devil May Cry 5, or they work on at least like 2 or 3 different IPs in the same team. So they're always working on new things, experimenting. Like the guy who directs Devil May Cry 5 has also like created racing games and stuff. Like they're all over the place in terms of like where their experience comes from and the kind of stuff they want to do. And I don't think Square quite has that, which is one of the things that Kiryu talked about. The fact they outsource so much means it's difficult for their own teams to learn how to make games and what to do.
Is a big part of this too. Yeah, the engine. Yeah,
for sure. Jacob, did you want to chime in on this?
Sure. So I want to loop back to talking about identity. I'm going to try and keep myself brief here. Clark said something interesting earlier in his initial answer to the question about identity, about the identity is the series is the best. I find that interesting because I think if we ask the developers of Call of Duty, what's the identity of this series, and we put a vision board up of what is Call of Duty, someone might put the best shooting specifically, like we have the best mechanics, but I don't think anybody would say that the identity of the series is the best. Meanwhile,
better than Battlefield.
Say again?
Better than Battlefield. That's the identity.
Better than Battlefield, exactly. And you know, you also earlier, you Daryl, you were talking about actually you and Clark were both talking about how interesting it was that like Assassin's Creed had that like crazy run from one through all the Desmond stuff and then even up to Black Flag. And the fact that it happened so fast, that 2 to Brotherhood to Revelations was like almost instantaneous. And like the Mass Effect trilogy, I also think about like that was like right at the last point in time where you could do that with a AAA game, where those came out so quickly. Which is why I was talking about earlier, trying to diversify the teams making Final Fantasy and have somebody making something lower budget and smaller, and hopefully having Creative Business Unit 1 keep making FF games in the current style that they're making them. But that's not important to this discussion, at least. So there's another element of the brand that I think sits next to the best, which is luxury. You were talking about you can't walk into a Hot Topic and find this stuff. Well, yeah, because Final Fantasy is too good for a Hot Topic. There is
whenever they do their events, it's always like, here's a wine bottle opener, and here's the Ultima fork. And
I was thinking about I bought a Persona T-shirt recently. Limited Run Games did box releases of the collector's edition of Golden, Persona 4 Golden or something, and I bought a Persona shirt. And it was a fine shirt. I don't normally buy nerd shirts. I don't like buying IP stuff. That's just not me, but I liked it because it was like subtle, it was classy, I liked it. But if I'm ever gonna buy a Final Fantasy shirt, it's gonna be like from the Yeti or like off of Etsy or something. Because when Final Fantasy decides to make t-shirts, well, we got this Japanese fashion designer to do one t-shirt for all 16 of the Final Fantasy games, and they're all ugly, and they all cost $90. The only one of those shirts I would have worn was maybe the Scions of the Seventh Dawn one. Like the 14 shirt I thought was okay. But like you have this brand image of it has to be the best. And I think about this is going to sound like bad because I'm talking about it as a Japanese thing specifically, because this occurs all over the place. But I think about a column, though with the word count it'd be more accurate to call it a novella. A column that Tim Rogers wrote years ago called "Dear Japan, It's Not Funny Anymore," which was clearly he like had an axe to so Tim Rogers, if anybody doesn't know, is a guy who lived and worked in Japan for like a decade. And this was written like shortly after he left, so I think at the time he was annoyed and had an axe to grind, and he probably would disagree with a lot of what he wrote now. But he talked about a business like a bakery or a cafe or something that had a certain name, and the people who opened it were just like, they're college friends. We got to start a business. What do we do? A restaurant. And they had like middling success. And then they had a chocolate croissant on their menu that sold unusually well. And like some magazine wrote about it. And they rebranded everything. The restaurant's now called Chocolate Croissant. They have a chain of restaurants called Chocolate Croissant because one time they sold really well with that one chocolate croissant. So now that's the identity. And I think about the fact that FF7 was their outsized success, and they read it as selling because it was the best. Because the only other games that looked like that at the time were like Blizzard games, and Blizzard games had fewer FMVs than Final Fantasy VII. I think the Legacy of Kain Soul Reaver announcement a remaster just got announced, and by total coincidence, I was going through stuff related to the Legacy of Kain games recently. And it is funny looking at the first one, Blood Omen, and it's like, wow, look at these cutting-edge FMVs that look terrible. They look like abysmal, awful. Their brand for a time was the best. And I feel like the problem is that whatever their brand was before that moment, it's continued to be the best. But I would argue, aside from, because we talked a lot about gameplay stuff, and I could get into that more, but I don't want to, because again, I'm trying to not talk for 6 hours here. I would argue this series has had an identity problem from minute one. Because you were talking about, it's so distinct and it's its own thing. It wasn't. It was a Dragon Quest ripoff. It was a Dragon Quest ripoff that basically said we're a little bit more visually serious.
To be clear,
go ahead.
Clear, I am not saying that Final Fantasy was necessarily unique, because you're right, it was a Dragon Quest ripoff. I am saying that it was a thing that was like relatively like a well-defined thing.
Sure, no, that's what I was about to say. It differentiated itself from Dragon Quest.
Such that if you liked Thing A, there was at least a decent enough chance for you to like Thing B. And then all the people who would play Thing B for the first time and Thing A for the first time would then both be interested in Thing C. All of this would then explode when you get all the way to something like FF7 through 10. Yeah. Anyway, go on.
No, I agree. I'm oversimplifying here a little bit with this, but even like people who ask for the turn-based combat to come. I saw somebody in chat earlier say something to the effect of like they got to stop with all this flashy nonsense and bring back turn-based combat. They've been trying to make action games since FF4. The active time battle system is an attempt to jazz up this system and make it faster and more actiony than Dragon Quest. I don't think, and I think part of why 10 is a good example of a turn-based game that was like actually has like, I wouldn't say like a great deal of tactical depth, but has like important decisions to make. You're looking at the turn
also
order.
Also can be very fast-paced if you want it to be.
Yes, exactly.
100%.
I think the identity problem is that, like I said earlier, they're not releasing enough games so that, like everybody was already saying, I'm repeating what was said previously, but like, if you liked FF15, you got to wait 6 more years for another one, and it might be different. a good way to remedy this would be whatever the team that made 16 was, they make another game they iterate on the gameplay style. Even if they change tone, aesthetics, they keep it as like an RPG DMC. If Creative Business Unit 1 keeps doing active time battle menu-based action games, and they got to get somebody in there, maybe the Bravely team, making turn-based games. But this is my problem with the identity, is that I think the identity is the best. It is luxury. And I don't really understand why. And I'm not saying that Square shouldn't release games that aren't they don't have the Final Fantasy in the title. But my problem is, why couldn't Bravely be a Final Fantasy game? You talked about the director wanted to go his own way and build his own IP. But I'm like, but why? Because all the Final Fantasy games are different in the first place. Why wasn't Parasite Eve a Final Fantasy game? Obviously, because it was based on a novel. But my point is, because it's in... Well, I guess a better example would be Forspoken. Forspoken can't be Final Fantasy because there's real world. Well, Hironobu Sakaguchi, who I think we would probably say he's the guy who knows, he made a movie set in New York City and called it Final Fantasy. So, like, I don't know where the lines are other than it has to be the most expensive and the best. And I think that's the identity problem, is because there's not a firmer thing for the public to latch onto because nobody sees it as the best.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The Square
But I
sees
mean,
it
the
as
only
the best.
person who knew
Okay.
the only person who knew what
Got
it
it.
was Sakaguchi, right? He had the vision for what Final Fantasy should or shouldn't be, and when he left, it became a free for all. What is it? I mean, they even did it in the 16 media tour, right? They asked all the creators, "What does Final Fantasy mean to you?" They all give completely different answers.
The group exercise that we were going to do today, if we hadn't gone totally out of control on time and had more questions, was I wanted to pull out a whiteboard and we would take turns going round robin and writing items. What do we think is like a key feature that a Final Fantasy game needs? And then what does Square think a key feature that a Final Fantasy game is that it needs? And I think we probably would have had a lot of overlap, to be fair. Like, I don't think Square is completely clueless.
Yeah.
But my point is, even, the brand went all over the place after Sakaguchi left. But I would argue the brand went all over the place while he was still there. Because 7, aside from it being turn-based, had very little to do with the games that were before it. Final Fantasy Tactics, I would almost, it almost transcends the brand. Like, it has, aside from there's magic and chocobos, and there's a guy named Sidolphus there, like, it feels like a totally distinct thing. I'm not saying that Square should not make games that aren't Final Fantasy, obviously. I'm not saying Star Ocean should have all been called Final Fantasy in space. But what I'm saying is, if they're only making a game every 6 years, then maybe they do need to lower their standards. Maybe they do need to find something to be the identity other than it's the best and the most expensive. Because to the layman, what's Final Fantasy's deal? What's the deal with Final Fantasy? And Square Enix executive says, well, you see, it's the best. The layman would say, no, it's not. So it's not working. So it needs to be, that's anyway, you guys had a really long discussion about this already. That's that's the 2 cents that I wanted to add in there. Since Clark literally worded it as it's the best, is the identity. Yeah. I think that's a problem.
I do want to get to Clark, and then we can be a bit mindful about wrapping things up here, because we have gone long, and I know it's getting kind of late for Daryl. So I would like to hear from Clark on this situation, and then I have some stuff to chime in. And then as far as the last bullet point goes, I was actually going to talk about I was going to float the idea of like what you guys think about like the return to turn-based, but I feel like we've actually incidentally kind of covered that throughout a lot of our discussions here. Well, I don't think any of us would like necessarily like oppose them necessarily like returning to turn-based for an idea. But we also, I think most of us agree that it's not necessary for them to do, unless the avenue that they do go down is actually too strictly scaled back. But Clark, please, I know you had something you want to say on this, so go ahead.
Well, I mean, definition, sadly, is common usage. Like that's actually what definition is. And so what is the common usage of Final Fantasy? How has it changed over the years? And the most singular element, like a title, that has identified the brand and the definition is the one that's most commonly used. And that is still 7, right?
Mm.
And so what's interesting is that now that 7 has changed, you know, has it watered down even what that means? And I think we're just in this phase where it kind of doesn't matter what Final Fantasy was. It doesn't matter what it is right now. It matters what it's going to be. Um, and like I said, if Final Fantasy XVI was effective and it was a dress to impress simulator, that is what Final Fantasy would be now. And there's
100%.
nothing that we could do to stop it. So, you know, identity
Oh
we can
no,
explore,
you're cutting out a
but
little bit.
if oh no,
You're
Oh,
back.
I'm
You're
I
back.
think you're
it's
back.
an
Go
interesting
on,
thing
yeah.
for us to explore. Okay,
I mean, it's
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 an
on that
interesting thing
similar
for us to
theme.
explore.
Zelda is another case in point, right? It's for a long time
Yeah.
it was one thing, and then Breath of the Wild happened.
Yeah,
Yeah. And then that too, though, with Breath of the Wild, I think it also goes along with kind of what I was talking about earlier, where Breath of the Wild is quite a different game than the Zelda games that came
yeah,
before it. However, when I do play it purely from a gameplay identity standpoint, I still do identify Zelda in there.
It's a Zelda
right?
game.
Like I still do. I was like, this is an entirely different way for me to experience Zelda, but it is still fundamentally Zelda. And that's what I think that Final Fantasy should strive to do between its games, where I'm saying this is a fundamentally different way for me to experience Final Fantasy. But I'm still looking at it and I'm saying that like, oh, this is the core of like what I value from FF as a game. And on the note of the best, I think the best is just too ambiguous. Too, I mean, what is the best, right? Like the best
The most
is
sales numbers.
right. The best
Right.
obviously is going to
Yep.
be so subjective from person to person. But like you said, if you asked what Call of Duty meant, that would probably be a little bit more objective.
This is
Of a
my trouble.
quantification.
Somebody
Right.
somebody in the
Yeah.
chat accused me a second ago and said this guy's POV is based on the popularity of the games / sales as a whole, not its quality. Right.
We're having
Yeah.
a conversation about the sales. That's
We're and
Yeah.
this
You know.
entire I'm saying that the brand identity is based off of the one time that they were the best selling game on their system. That's what
Yeah.
I'm talking about. I mean, I'm surrounded
Yeah.
by 3 other guys
Right.
who have had plenty of conversations about the more
Right.
minute stuff. That's why I'm filling in this
right.
other gap here.
But okay,
Ultimately, you can make
what
the
I'm
best
saying,
game of all time,
here's-
but if it sells no copies,
sure.
Go on, Clark. What
Yeah.
were you trying to say?
Okay, here, but what I'm saying is that it doesn't matter. Like, it doesn't matter what it was. It doesn't matter what it is. I am more interested in it selling 20 million copies. And if the pathway to that is that it's dress 3 impress. Like if it is a clothing simulator, if it is so fundamentally different that it redefines what we consider Final Fantasy, I consider that a success. And I do say that like there's nothing about its previous identity of like what it ever was or what it's planning to be that that is really going to help it plan in the future. I don't
And
think that.
I actually want to back you up on that a little bit
Yeah.
real fast because
Yeah.
some people may be going, "What is he talking about? How would it be a success if it became Dress to Impress?" I want to talk about the Resident Evil series again, where that
Yeah.
series was. That was anybody who doesn't know the story of RE6. It is Hubris, the video game. They set out to create the ultimate horror experience. This campaign will be a Call of Duty campaign. This campaign will be kind of more survival horror, but not really because we're focused on our like superhero kung fu espionage stuff.
Yes.
They had to do a total reset and go back to Resident Evil 7. And
Devil
do a
May Cry had the
first-person-
same thing as well, right? It's
do a first-person horror
DMC.
game. Well, sorry, what I was going to say is just all I was going to say was once that was successful, once they got people back in and they'd reestablished a baseline, then they could do Resident Evil 3 remake and Resident Evil 4 remake, which I would say are honestly better realizations of what they were trying to do with 6 anyway. And they're making first-person really spooky VR horror games. So
100%.
Right.
100%.
There
That's
needs to be a
exactly
baseline.
the point.
Yeah.
What I'm saying is that we need to create Final Fantasy, and we haven't. And none of the stuff anybody's brought up is Final Fantasy that can sustain a brand for the next 20 years. Nothing.
I guess the challenge
not
here
even
is that
not even Rebirth, which I think is the game of the year, and die on that sword. You know, I don't think that is enough. I think whatever comes next, we haven't talked about yet and hasn't come up yet.
Yeah.
So
I guess the challenge with Resident Evil is that, you know, they were able to reimagine the franchise in that way, and you know, obviously there could be a degree of coincidence here, but PT clearly had a very big impact, and like the survival horror genre as a whole was going first person, and they were like, we need to latch onto that and use our incredibly successful and relevant brand to put ourselves at the top of the tree. And they did that obviously by making a very, very good entry into that particular genre, which then made them relevant
PT
again.
is fascinating because it created a market vacuum.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
But Final Fantasy doesn't necessarily have that. I mean, it feels as though they were trying in some ways to replicate The Witcher 3.
Right.
A lot of people were trying to replicate that, but they just didn't quite understand why that game was successful. Rebirth honestly feels a bit closer. In terms of the depth of the game and everything.
Right.
But like there hasn't really been like a game that is close enough, because they can't just go and suddenly make a Baldur's Gate 3 clone and call it Final Fantasy. I think that would be a bit too jarring potentially.
Why not?
But I mean, why not?
That's
they
the
already
point.
They already did it with DMC, right? Like, they created DMC.
But like ultimately, they just need to figure out
Baldur's Gate 3 as if it's an out of nowhere success. People talk about Baldur's Gate 3 like it's an out of nowhere success, and it is in terms of sales. But that team has been making that type of game for a really long time. This is what Ryan was talking about with regards
Divinity
to
games
Final Fantasy needs to iterate.
Are not low sellers. Like Divinity Original Sin 2, I think is close to 10 million copies. Like it's the same as like FromSoft as well. People think that Dark Souls games haven't sold very many, but you know, Dark Souls 3 is a very high selling game. Even Bloodborne, I think, is on 7-8 million copies. Like they aren't like selling a 1 million, you know, here and there. It's like,
and by the way, Sony, it'd sell another 5 million units if you re-released it. Just saying.
They know. Yeah, so I think that's the point I want to say is, and I was given the terminology by everybody here, which is that how Final Fantasy propels itself as a brand is it goes two ways. One, it scales back, becomes something smaller, and then holds out for a Netflix special like Castlevania did, and then finds its opportunity to re-enter the market. Or it does what Resident Evil does and finds a vacuum, a market vacuum like PT created, and build on that.
I'm also going to say, I'm going to build off of what you just said, because the Castlevania series and the upcoming Devil May Cry series are examples of letting somebody else have it for a minute. I'm going to argue, no matter how much you love either of them, Advent Children and Kingsglaive did not grow the brand. They did not attract people. If Square tries to get Visual Works to make a Final Fantasy TV show and put it on Netflix, it doesn't matter how pretty it looks, because it's not going to look better than Spider-Verse. The best should not be their brand identity. They need to trust someone else with the material a little bit. And I know FF fans, Square Enix fans in general, don't like to hear that. Like, I made a video, the last video I made, which was 8 months ago, I talked about Square. They really need to let they need to let somebody else internally make another Kingdom Hearts spinoff to help with more like onboarding and getting young kids into the series again.
I mean, what you're describing is the biggest problem they have, in that the people like Kitase, Nomura, Nojima, Toriyama, they won't let anyone else touch any of their things. It's why Final Fantasy X, despite the fact there being huge demand for a 10.3, they're not going to touch it until they're done with remake, if ever. They like it's. I covered it in one of the videos about the 13 remaster. They have a thing in their minds where they cannot work on a property unless someone senior that worked on the original game is involved. So no matter what it is, like even the Zodiac Age, they helmed it by two of the most senior programmers that worked on the original Final Fantasy XII. Like, Itahana has to be involved with the 9 remake on Unity. Like, why? Like, it doesn't make any sense why like they can't do these things unless these people are explicitly involved. It's like Hamaguchi is a huge Final Fantasy VII fan, like huge.
Yeah.
Why does he need like 5 people above him being like, no, that's not what this character would do?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Did you want to elaborate on that, Clark? I feel like you had something.
No,
you wanted to say.
I just love it.
Okay.
I just love it.
Okay. So, I think I want to get everyone's kind of like closing mission statement on how they think Final Fantasy should really revitalize itself. I guess I will go ahead and go first, and then I'll pass the baton around and let you guys kind of close it out for me. What I believe Final Fantasy needs to do, first of all, I'm a big believer in what BabySeal Clark was saying about the Netflix specials, putting it out there more in the multimedia format. I do agree that letting someone handle those things that Jacob mentioned with people who know how to make films, who know how to make those types of projects work and appeal to those people, I do think that's the correct way to go. The reason I'm a big believer in having at the very least, a certain type of game, not that every Final Fantasy needs to have the exact same battle system, not that every Final Fantasy needs to play so similar to each other, but the reason I believe that there at least needs to be a type of game that they are making, a certain play style, is because at the very least, what you can do in terms of having people come along is that those people, if I like game A, the chance of me liking game B increases. So anyone who's introduced to game A or game B will then join along for game C. The other thing about it is that, I know that purely from an artistic perspective, FF being the omakase style of experience is really nice, really form pushing. The issue that I see, however, is more in the engineer brain. And when I look at it from the engineer brain, I'm thinking about how do we put these titles out in a more effective, faster way. I'm thinking about how do we create a style and then grow that style. I'm also thinking about the general game quality. Like I said, Kingdom Hearts 2. You don't get Kingdom Hearts 2 without Kingdom Hearts 1. You don't get Bloodborne without the Souls games that came before it, and then you don't get Elden Ring without any of that other stuff. And I also think that there's just a lot of shame in leaving these really good, really interesting combat systems behind as first drafts to never really reach their full potential. In a way, I kind of view that as creative waste. Like that these like really brilliant systems just get left. And there has to be some consistency there in order for them to continue to build a following. Because if if you're saying a different thing every day, if Final Fantasy means something different every single second, then some people fall off and some people fall on, but you're not building, right? You build on Elden Ring, you build on my first Souls game was Sekiro, or my first Souls games was like Bloodborne, and then you get both of them to buy Elden Ring. You build, and that has been what I think should be the core. I think that they haven't had a really universally acclaimed battle system since Final Fantasy VII was the first time that they had it in basically 20 years, since 10, where the vast majority of people really were like, this is like the style that I want from Final Fantasy. They haven't had
anyone else wanting to imitate them.
Yeah, exactly. But now, Dragon Age Veilguard. Guess which game they were inspired by? Final Fantasy VII Remake. And that's like the first time that I've really I think that maybe some people said they were inspired by 12's Gambit, but that's still closing in on 20 years since like someone has really named like a Final Fantasy game as like deep inspiration for a recent Final Fantasy game as deep inspiration for something that they're working on. And so I
couldn't think of the name. Sorry, I was looking for Unicorn Overlord. That's obviously inspired by the Gambit system. But that's
Yeah.
unrelated to your point. Sorry, I just like
Right.
sorry, my brain was just screaming and I couldn't find the name of the game.
Right.
Continue.
And even 12 in general is still really built off of the ATB system that came before it. It created something new using the fundamental brand identity of Final Fantasy, that gameplay identity. And so ultimately, what I'm trying to say is that consistency leads to a consistent following, addresses a lot of engineering and practicality aspects, still allows them to innovate and change and still have Final Fantasy be that omakase experience where you're trusting in the chef to deliver a certain thing. But even at the omakase, you don't go in there and get like In and Out or Whataburger or like, something like, something that's like entirely random. You still know at the omakase you're getting Japanese food, right? So I do believe that fundamentally, I want to see Final Fantasy continue to change and be a completely different thing. But I also realize the vast number of issues that come along with straying so far with the complexities of 8-year development cycles, $200 million budgets, and these sorts of things, and what investors are going to want. Because remember, the whole reason Final Fantasy switched to action combat eventually was not even like, that wasn't like a purely creative decision. They were very much looking at, well, if we're spending $150 million making this game, we have to produce something that will yield an ROI and that feels safe enough to do. It wasn't just like, no, we don't like turn-based games anymore, right? That's just 100% not our creative vision anymore. It had a lot to do with getting an ROI. So even then, I would say that these systems are not being created purely out of, artistic vision. They're being creative around the restriction of capitalism anyway. All I'm trying to say is that create something that will also meet the needs of the, of the investors of the company, and that will also meet the needs, or the desires, I should say, of fans and the type of systems that they want at the fundamentals. And then there's so much room to innovate, because at the very least, if you have that core called Final Fantasy, you can put anything else on top of it. And that to me has always been where the magic has actually been, and not necessarily it being just the wild card experience. Daryl, I'll let you have the next closing statement.
I think there's a lot there that's very true in terms of what you were saying there. I think if you think back to the older days of Square, their initial foundations were they were a very scattergun company. They chased trends. It didn't really work out for them. Final Fantasy was where they kind of struck gold just randomly, because role-playing games at that point weren't even really mass market, and Dragon Quest was like a real a driving force behind that in terms of like even making that genre exist. They just happened to kind of latch onto that very, very fortunately. But after that, they were like, what was their identity? We're going to make the best role-playing games, right? That was our thing. Actually, their initial identity was we're going to knock Dragon Quest off their perch. Like that was their goal. And it was interesting. You mentioned, Jacob, about the action and the ATB system. And actually, Secret of Mana was supposed to be Final Fantasy IV, but Sakaguchi said no. It's too much of a change. It's too much. Our existing fans will be alienated. Go and create a new IP with that if you want to, because he was mindful that you can move forward and you can try and create a new identity, but it's far easier to retain customers than it is to acquire new ones. And I think that's one of the struggles that Final Fantasy has had in terms of the long development cycles, them feeling as though they need to recycle their audience to get a new audience. It's led to them kind of being stuck in terms of, okay, what do we do? Do we move forward, or do we pay tribute to the past? And we kind of get these mishmash experiences where they're not too sure what it is they're trying to do. And then, Final Fantasy XV's tagline was a game for new timers and old timers, essentially, or something to that effect. And the way they catered to old timers was like, nods to the past and like, really like the amount of like tributes in that game that are really, really detailed and thoughtful are intense. And like, from a lore perspective, the game really does pay tribute to the past, more than actually games like 13 and 12 ever did. But in terms of other aspects, it didn't. So it's a very difficult situation in terms of how to rebuild, but it does feel as though they somehow needs to try and find the balance in terms of how do they please everyone, like, because you can try and strike gold again like they did with the original Final Fantasy and like they did with Final Fantasy VII. Probability wise, unlikely to happen because they don't have a strong enough foundation. So it's just going to be pot luck if they do that. The smartest choice from a business perspective is to follow the FromSoft mold or follow what Resident Evil have done now that they have managed to reinvent themselves. Because I don't think Final Fantasy is quite at the DMC Resident Evil 6 period. Like, it is not, like, they still have Rebirth, which is a very, very well-regarded game. Like, it's not like people are, and even in Final Fantasy 16, the negativity around it is greatly amplified, but ultimately it's still sold, decently well. It was very well reviewed. It was nominated for many, many awards. Like, it's not like this game was terrible. It may not have aligned with expectations, but that doesn't mean it was a terrible game. They have foundations that they could build on if they wanted to. And, the Rebirth aside, you're always going to kind of get diminishing returns with how they work as a sequel, etc., and people kind of know what they're going to expect. But when you do... like when 16 was announced, there was so much positivity. I mean, you, Ryan, were like, as soon as you saw that CBU3 logo, you were like, let's go, right? Because that logo meant something to you. Yeah. You had that experience that you were just talking about. You were like, I'm going to trust this no matter what. Like, just completely, I'm all in. And that's where we want to get back to. And I think Square Enix as a whole, going back to that initial thing, they Final Fantasy worked. They decided to say, we're going to be the best role-playing game makers. And from that, if you follow their path from that point through to the end of the 60-bit era, they pumped out so many role-playing games that were, sometimes clones of each other, or sometimes just explored other avenues. Like, the Romancing Saga was at one point supposed to be seen as the sister of Final Fantasy. Like, they were the two main IPs. Final Fantasy was like the kind of beginner, linear-ish role-playing game, and Romancing Saga was like the crazy, off-the-wall, like non-linear, all over the place one. And they both had a place. In Japan, they were selling not too dissimilar sales figures. And then the PlayStation era happened. Final Fantasy managed to find its path. Saga just did not whatsoever. They tried to reinvent themselves. Saga Frontier sold okay, but from that point on, the franchise just dwindled away into kind of insignificance, unfortunately, if you look at the most recent Saga entry. Final Fantasy is not at that point yet. And as long as they kind of course correct, there is still very much a future for it. And hopefully that future, whatever they do next, does essentially what Clark was saying, that they can bring in a new audience. Because ultimately, Final Fantasy VII, the audience that game brought in, replaced the old audience. They kind of unfortunately rendered the audience that was built up from 1 through 6 kind of irrelevant. And there was a much bigger crowd saying, this is what we want. And then you had the smaller crowd saying, but I really want this. And this bigger crowd was more important to them because they had the potential to generate more revenue for the company. I think we were all hoping that 16 was going to do that it was going to be kind of a Breath of the Wild thing. Like, I don't imagine Zelda going back to games like Ocarina of Time and Wind Waker and like Skyward Sword. Like, it's just not going to happen. They might do it they would be classified as spin-offs now, right? But who knows? Tears of the Kingdom, after that, they may choose to iterate upon that model, or they may choose to make something completely different that they think is going to surpass even what they did before. But other franchises, they're in a position where they can do that, and they always know that they can go back to it if it doesn't work out that well. But that's kind of like how I feel in terms of rebuilding. Like, they need to find a way that they can leverage and keep people like us happy, essentially like the core fan base who have been with the franchise for a long time. And I feel so for like 80-90% of what they are, Remake and Rebirth actually accomplished that. But the other aspects of it were polarizing to the point where it dissuaded people, like turned people off completely. And that you saw the exact same thing happen with Lightning Returns. Like, they were like, we're going to completely change everything that you liked about this game. and people were just like, okay, what's going on here? Why did you do this? And even with the second game, it's like, Lightning's on the box art. She's in the game for like 5 minutes. Like, the choices they make sometimes don't necessarily lead to conducive results. But yeah, like, I think better IP management, better thought about what Final Fantasy should be. But Square Enix as a whole needs to try and figure out what they want to be as a company. Do they want to be known as a pioneer of role-playing games? Or do they want to be known as a kind of like jack of all trades? Okay, we're going to be making this and then this and this and this, whatever. Because, they do have some properties like Nier that people do consider best in class. And they've chosen to not iterate on that. And you don't quite know what you're going to get from Square Enix, and Final Fantasy is obviously part of that. You know what you're going to get from Team Asano, and I think that's the only probably part of the entire company where you literally know what you're going to get. But even with Yoshida now, like, that mantra has kind of been shattered because 16 didn't quite deliver on what people expected from him based on how much reverence they have for him for 14. So, there's a kind of a misstep there, and they've got to try and build that reputation back up. And it's ultimately they're in a reputation building phase. But they've got a very strong base in which they can build from. But almost every part of the business is going through that transition. Like the mobile games, Kiryu is very transparent. He said the mobile games we're making do not appeal to the existing audience anymore. The audience has grown up, their expectations have changed, and we're catering for things that they wanted 5 years ago. Like, you can't do that and succeed as a business. You either kind of evolve, keep up with what people want to see, or you just kind of fade away into obscurity.
Wow, very well said. As a side note, I just realized how funny it is that like me and you are like wearing like very opposite clothes right now. That I'm in like this cut tank because like in Texas it's so hot, and like you're wearing a hoodie. I just thought that was really funny. Clark, are you with us? Clark.
Well,
Closing statements. Yes.
well. Okay. So I actually I do want to clarify that I mostly agree with you in terms of needing to iterate. However, where we are now, I fundamentally do not believe we have something to iterate upon. And as much as I love Rebirth and think it's like, I think that the 7R trilogy's identity is an example of why what you're saying is real. Is you can establish an identity based on something and give people an opportunity to experience more and more and more of that and enjoy themselves. I don't think turn-based combat is something to iterate on. I'm not opposed to it, but I have not played anything turn-based that was engaging enough to sustain a brand. Like, you can look at other successful turn-based things and say, oh, but those are successful. It's rarely the turn-based element that's engaging or interesting about it. Like, it's, the Pokemon collecting or, the dog fighting or whatever it is that you do in the game that propels you to like that and want to iterate upon it. Like that, I completely agree with you on. Where I think we are, though, is I do think we're in a little bit more of a dire situation for the brand identity than Resident Evil was between 6 and 7, because, like we mentioned, 6 was still a very successful Resident Evil. Like it's still the biggest seller. They realized that nobody liked it, and before Resident Evil 7 could be the end of the series, they figured out the direction to go, and they filled that PT void, which is, really good. So I do think that Final Fantasy as a brand needs to find that thing. And how they find that thing is to find that vacuum. And how that gets filled, that's really hard. That's like a huge order. But I do believe that's what's needed. And how I really think that gets filled is with younger developers, with fresher talent. To develop something, some kind of core, and we could even call it a JRPG experience, because that term too is now meaningless. Whether it's more character action or more traditional RPG, or whether it's a tactical RPG, something that is just really fresh needs to be the starting point for mainline titles. And I do think that that's really what we need to start iterating on. So I agree, iteration is important. I don't think we have the answer to what to iterate on at all. If, gun to my head, you had to say, hey, what's the thing to do? I'd probably agree with you. 7R. 7R is the best thing that they have right now. And it is something that you can build on with a new, different game. I think they kind of blew their proverbial load with that on 7R, which for me is fine because I like 7. And I think 7 is its own thing. It's almost its own thing enough that it's, going to be classically distinct from Final Fantasy 20 years from now, like in the way that we view both brands individually, But I really do think that's the case. But more to it, what I think the solution to the brand problem is the one that we've all agreed on, and it's that Square Enix is having issues managing their IPs, period. And the ones that are succeeding seem to have other people's names on them, like Platinum, for instance. And so there's this real hope that when Kiryu is making statements about tearing down the walls between these teams, that what he's addressing is that problem. The problem of not making it at 10-3 because the developers are busy, like giving so much ownership of that thing to those people. And so there is a chance that they're already addressing some of this stuff, and we won't know for 2 to 3 years. Dev cycles being long sucks. There's no doubt about it. And it's hard to stagger releases without multiple teams. And I do think that that's this big floating problem that's got solutions that may have not even materialized yet for them as the development landscape changes. Like, we're all real upset about AI right now, but who knows what we'll really feel about that once it's so ubiquitous that we have, surrendered to our robot overlords. Will it even be a point that we talk or argue about anymore? So those are problems that might rely on a solution that doesn't exist yet. And that sucks to be in that state. So I agree with pretty much everything you said. I do think, though, that a reality exists where, Final Fantasy survives. And I do think the problem still is that it is associated with this prestige, and that the answer to solving that prestige is not by making it more uniform with what it was. I think it is time for the Final Fantasy to come out. Like a new game that sort of reboots what we consider to be Final Fantasy, Drop the
Should have been
numbers.
Stranger of Paradise. Conceptually, that game had so much potential to reboot the entire franchise.
But again,
because they could have-
it's more of that same problem where it's like, okay, we're not filling a vacuum that needs to be filled. There are Neo games. They existed. This is just Neo 4. Like this didn't
But
make
that could
any
have been
sense.
that could
Yeah.
have been their moment though, where kind of similar to PT, where it was like, okay, what Stranger of Paradise ended up being was so far removed from what it could have been in terms of
Sure.
a Final Fantasy based
Yeah.
Soulsborne game would have
Right.
sold more if it was done well than any Neo game.
Definitely.
Any
100%.
JoJo
I
fans
agree.
here? Like the thing that comes to my mind is like Steel Ball Run, Part 7
Yeah.
of JoJo's, where it's a complete reboot of JoJo's, and it starts over again, and you have a different Jonathan Joestar, and they basically redefine the Joestar bloodline from then on, and like how the course of that series is going. And so
Yeah.
You're surprised.
That's where I'm
surprised
at.
that I like JoJo and I make JoJo references in like my
You
my
do,
videos all the time. I'm surprised.
You
Anyway,
look
yeah.
like a JoJo character.
mad.
What
I
are you
do.
talking about, chat?
I'm literally
if
a
they'd have done
Stan
that
user.
properly,
Yeah.
Yeah.
if they'd have done that properly, they could have done Stranger of Paradise 2, which is Jack reimagining the world of Final Fantasy 2, and then 3, and then 4. Like any of those 16-bit games would have been great for that kind of style, essentially. And then you've got a pipeline of games that you can iterate on. That it makes sense to do so.
Right. But even that, like, it had this spin-off glow to it, like immediately. Like,
Yeah.
And you're like
The
looking
initial
at the main
launch trailer
character.
set the expectation immediately as being terrible.
Right.
They were already on damage control from day one.
Yeah, and I mean, like, yeah, and a lot of it is there's this development mindset that's associated with it. The fact that Nomura was kind of like disappointed that people guessed the plot, like of the game based on the trailer, like that kind of stuff. Like, there's just a lot of that weird ego that can often get in the way of the creative process, and I do, and to be clear, I think there are team. I love Nomura. Nomura is an incredible artist, but there's stuff like that we see as a consumer burst through the seams and make public view, and that's something that a company is really good at managing its own employees in. And Nomura is an employee. That's something that could have been managed from the top down. And the way that all of that PR stuff just bleeds through makes you feel like, once again, this is not one company. It's 7, where every CBU is its own company with its own set of feelings, and we really do. I think Final Fantasy needs one Square Enix, in order to reboot successfully. So that's my closing thought on
Very,
this.
very base take. I really
Like
love
a
what you said
master
at the
team.
end. Yeah, because there used to be this joke where people would say, "Oh, this is CBU 3 Square Enix, and that's CBU 1 Square Enix. It's not the same." And that joke, come to find out, had like real legitimacy into it because they operate as functionally different companies, with all under the name Square Enix. So Jacob, close us out, man.
Okay, I guess my closing statement will come in a couple parts. I'm not going to repeat too intensely what I've already said multiple times about the series, and I would say the company in general needs to humble themselves a bit in their own perception of themselves. But one specific area that I'll talk about is do a cost-effectiveness assessment on how big your games are. To give an example, as a big Rebirth fan, loved Rebirth. I'm a freak for Final Fantasy. I took a couple days off from work when Rebirth came out to be able to put time into it. I have not beaten it. I loved that game. I have not had time to finish it. And ask yourself, would that game have sold fewer units if Gungaga wasn't a zone? If it had even 10 fewer side quests. Now, I'm one of the 7 people in the world that liked the Gungaga Zone. I liked pretty much every side quest that there was until the very ending when I started to get a little sick of them. But my point is, nobody knows how big your game is until they buy it anyway. And certainly there's a little bit of a, maybe you're hoping for word of mouth afterwards about, oh man, how big this thing is. But you need to pull back a little bit. Final Fantasy XVI didn't need to be as big as it was. It didn't need to be as long as it was to achieve what it was trying to do artistically. I bring this up specifically because we talked about somewhat sarcastically saying, don't listen to your fans earlier in this. I think that what we're seeing with 15's design bloat, 16's design bloat, Rebirth's bloat, and I would argue even our precious Final Fantasy XIV, even those expansions get a little bloated. When I'm ready and juiced up for the plot to continue in Shadowbringers, why am I fixing a cart and fighting Ranjit, the worst villain in Final Fantasy XIV, for the 7th time? Because everybody complains 13 is too linear. 13 doesn't have enough stuff going on. These games are too short. You're trying too hard to impress us, and you don't need to. Pull back a little bit, get the game out 6 months earlier, save yourself a little bit of money, get a better margin, because it's not netting you higher sales. On that note, I'll also say, Daryl was talking a minute ago about the series has not had that the series has not had that RE6-esque catastrophe. It hasn't. 16 is a much better game than RE6, and it was received much better than RE6, even if RE6 sold better. The trouble is, the reason RE could bounce back fast enough and be reflexive as it was is because that was a very nimble development team that could make a lot of games. When 6 failed, even before we get to 7, they could go, okay, that didn't really work. Let's do Revelations 2. And let's do like this, okay, let's kind of take it halfway back to survival horror, still kind of actiony, still third person, but they were nimble. They had the ability to experiment because Resident Evil for a while was like an annual franchise. Now, obviously, you guys can't crank out games of the scale that you're trying to do annually. Obviously not, and I wouldn't ask you to. Most studios can't these days. But the fact is, back in the day, you could experiment. You could do different things because if somebody didn't like 8, 9 was right around the corner. 10 was right around the corner. Tactics was right there. Your re-release of 5 on the PlayStation was right there. Let Creative Business Unit 1 focus in on the design they've already got. Let Creative Business Unit 3, the team that made 16, let them focus in on the design that they've already got and take that to the next entry and get it out faster. Establish another team or get another team that already exists and tell them you are making smaller scale, classic Final Fantasy games or something to that effect. Final Fantasy needs to be releasing a major entry, and major just means you tell us that it's major. It can be like a much smaller budget game. It can be a throwback to PS1 pre-rendered backgrounds. You just tell us.
Don't classify as a spin-off.
Don't classify it as a spin-off.
Don't undermine it, yeah.
Don't classify it as
Final
a spin-off,
Fantasy
don't undermine
Explorers.
it. In fact, drop the Roman numerals entirely. I'll loop back to that as my final item in this. Don't mitigate it. Push it. Because guess what? I think about FF9 didn't sell well. And you decided, people don't want that. People want 8. They want the realistic visuals. Well, 9 came out at the wrong moment. Everybody wanted to see it look bigger and better and more realistic. Everybody was excited about that race. That's why 10 was the last time that you guys sold a game based entirely off of nobody's making something that looks this good or is this good or is this advanced. People hated Wind Waker when it came out for the same reason that people hated 9. But now, Nintendo's looped back around. They can make cartoony Zeldas. They can make Zeldas that look like they're little toys, and they sell well. So revisit why certain things didn't do well and understand that there might have been extenuating circumstances. Don't feel like because that thing did poorly, it's going to do poorly forever. Show people what's fun. Because if people play whatever that first game from Creative Business Unit 1 is after the remake trilogy, if they make a fresh new Final Fantasy XVIII with that combat system, and people go, That was fantastic. What other Final Fantasy stuff is there? Well, next year, maybe you put out that PS1 throwback turn-based game. And if it's got a good enough story, if it's got cool enough art, the guy who played that action game or who really liked FF16 is going to try that as well. Show them what's fun. Trust what your developers are doing, and then show people what's fun. Stick to a couple of core teams and some core designs and keep pushing those. Keep iterating on those instead of feeling like that didn't work. Tear it up. Try something totally new. And you'll be nimble enough and scale back your projects enough that when one of them maybe isn't the end-all be-all success, you got another one coming in 2 years instead of 6 years. And lastly, this is a nitpick, but talking about Stranger of Paradise, talking about the titles, you need to do something about your titles because they are alienating to people who don't know anything about the series. And I don't just mean the Roman numerals. We mentioned somebody earlier in here, I forget if it was Daryl or Clark, but talked about specifically the pirate Yakuza in Hawaii and the man who erased his name.
Yeah.
This isn't just like a Japanese game issue having difficulty marketing. Other folks have succeeded where you guys are lagging behind. The Man Who Erased His Name is a brilliant title. You don't know anything about the Yakuza or Like a Dragon series, but okay, there's a guy and he's undercover, or he's faked his own death, or maybe he's been erased from the history books, but it lights your imagination on fire, and it gives you some idea of what you're getting into. Nobody knows what Stranger of Paradise means, and it doesn't attract anybody to the product. Oh, well, if you play Stranger of Paradise, or if you play 358 Days Over 2, you'll learn what the title means. No. Stop. Also, stop that Discord, whatever you're doing with the thumbs up thing. Don't do that. The title needs to draw me in, not because it creates a mystery, but because it tells me what's fun about the game. You don't need to be so unique. Dissidia shouldn't have been called Dissidia. It should have been called Final Fantasy Contest of Heroes or something. Even the Persona games, Tactica, Strikers, I get it. I know what it is. Reload, Golden, Royal, they're punchy.
Final Fantasy Tactics.
Done.
Perfect.
You did it. You did it. You had it before. Where'd it go?
Mm-hmm.
You had it.
Yeah.
Stranger of Paradise should have been called Final Fantasy Punch Man. Who punches a lot.
I mean, even just Final Fantasy Origin, I thought that's generally what the name was going to be.
Yeah.
Then you could do Final Fantasy 2 Origin if you
Yeah.
wanted to. Like, just the Origin being the new Dynasty Warriors is doing it now, right? They've got rid of the numbering. Dynasty Warriors Origin.
And I guess I thought that was gonna be my last thing, but I just thought of one other thing that I'll offer. Actually, I can't offer too much when you aren't paying me to be an actual consultant, Square. But I will say this: we were talking about multimedia. I don't know if you guys saw this news item, but there was an attempt to get an FF14 live-action TV show off the ground a couple of years ago. But it was it was being pitched right when COVID happened. Studios were tightening their purse strings. People weren't interested. Square, you got a great IP with FF14. It's standalone successful on its own. However, it's impenetrable. Final Fantasy fans don't want to try an MMO. Normies don't want to try an MMO. That's understandable. League is a great IP, but people don't want to play League because League is awful. Also, other reasons. People don't want to play League, but you've got this big IP that people are aware of and they're familiar with, and you just made a TV show called Arcane that people really want to, oh, should I play Arcane? Should I play League? And all your friends say, no, it's toxic, it's awful, don't play it. But they release Wild Rift. They release X2KO, whatever the fighting game. That's also not a great name for a game. Everybody's just going to call it the League Fighter.
2 times KO.
Square, think about releasing some single-player spin-offs set in the Final Fantasy XIV universe. Specifically, the one I want to see. Matsuno didn't get to finish his storyline. He was going to do more after Bosnia, but then Endwalker kind of, like, what happened in the machinations of the plot, we couldn't really continue with that. Like, the story would have ended. Go back in time, do a little spin-off about what happened with all that Matsuno Bosnia stuff before Endwalker. Release that as a single-player turn-based game, action game, tactical game. Who the hell cares? And now my Final Fantasy friends, or my friends in general, are like, I want to play FF14, but MMO, it's too much. Hand them this great game that's got a Koji Fox, localization, that's got the aesthetics, that has the world, that has the vibes of it, but that is much more accessible. Final Fantasy XIV is almost its own IP separate from all of this, but that's something else that you can be doing, is that is a game that is actively building your brand in a really strong way, and you're not you're not using it enough. If you've got a compilation of Final Fantasy VII, there should be a compilation of FF14 at this point. And that's the last thing I'll say.
Amazing. Guys, I want to thank you all so much. Daryl, I want you to get to sleep. I know I kept you for so long here. I feel so bad, dude. I'm so sorry. But we've had a really amazing conversation. I think this has just been by far like one of the best FF podcasts like ever done ever. I'm very, 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 very thankful. This feels like a podcast you can literally show to Square. I hope they do see it, honestly, guys. So I'm gonna let you guys all go. I love you all so much. If you're on Twitter, we're gonna raid my friend Hyun. And yeah, if you need to find any of these guys, if you're watching this, I will have a link to all of their channels. Actually, they should be tagged all in the description below.